exposed nerves. The detour seemed like providence at the time. Now, crouched behind a boulder with my heart hammering against my ribs, I understand that some paths close for a reason. It started innocently enough. The trail was overgrown but manageable, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. Moss covered everything like a green shroud, and the air tasted thick with decomposition and new growth fighting for dominance. I'd been hiking these woods since I could walk, knew every trail within 10 miles of the village, but this path felt different, older, as if the forest itself had tried to swallow it whole and failed. 3 hours in, the trees began to change. The familiar oaks and maples gave way to something else, gnarled things with bark that looked like melted wax, their branches reaching at impossible angles. The canopy grew so dense that noon felt like twilight, and my phone's GPS started glitching, the blue dot representing my location jumping erratically across the screen before the signal died entirely. That's when I found the clearing. It appeared suddenly, as if the forest had simply decided to stop. One moment I was pushing through undergrowth so thick I could barely see 5 feet ahead. The next I stood at the edge of a perfect circle of grass, maybe 50 yards across. The transition was surgical. No gradual thinning, no natural boundary. Just woods, then nothing, then woods again on the far side. In the center sat the barn. My first thought was that it couldn't possibly be real. Not because of anything overtly strange about its appearance. It looked like any other barn, really. Red paint peeling in places, gambrel roof slightly sagging, a large sliding door on one side. What made no sense was its existence. This deep and protected forest land, there should be nothing man-made. No roads led here, no power lines, no signs of any homestead or farm that might have justified its construction. Yet there it stood, solid and undeniable, surrounded by grass so uniformly short it looked mowed. Not a single weed or wildflower interrupted the green carpet. Even stranger, while the barn showed its age, the field around it seemed frozen in time. No fallen leaves despite the autumn season, no animal tracks, no variation in the grass height. It was like looking at a photograph that had been cut out and pasted onto the wrong background. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I'd developed over years of solo hiking screamed at me to leave. But curiosity is a peculiar thing. It overrides wisdom with such ease, especially when you're young enough to believe that bad things happen to other people, in other places. I stepped into the clearing. The temperature dropped instantly, maybe 10 degrees, though no wind stirred the grass. My breath didn't fog, but the cold penetrated straight through my jacket, settling into my bones like it belonged there. The silence hit me next, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals. Even my footsteps seemed muted, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The barn door stood slightly ajar, darkness visible through the gap. As I approached, details emerged that made my skin crawl. The wood was wrong somehow. The grain ran in perfect straight lines, no knots or variations, like it had been printed rather than grown. The rust on the hinges formed symmetrical patterns, even the peeling paint curled in identical spirals, as if decay itself followed a blueprint here. I reached for the door, then hesitated. Through the gap came a smell, sweet and organic, like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. Behind it lurked another odor, fainter but more disturbing. It reminded me of the biology lab at school, that particular combination of formaldehyde and something else, something that had once been alive. My hand was inches from the door when I heard it, a soft thump from inside, followed by what sounded like breathing. Not human breathing exactly, too deep, too wet, like air being forced through liquid. The sound came in a rhythm that didn't match any breathing pattern I knew, sometimes fast, sometimes impossibly slow, as if whatever made it couldn't quite remember how lungs were supposed to work. I backed away, my own breathing shallow and quick. The darkness beyond the door seemed to shift. Not quite movement, but the suggestion of it, like seeing something in your peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn to look. Another thump, closer to the door this time. Then another. The breathing sound grew louder, multiplied, as if there were several sources now, all slightly out of sync. That's when I ran. I sprinted across that unnatural grass, plunged back into the forest, and didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. When I finally collapsed against a tree to catch my breath, I realized I could hear the forest again. Birds calling, leaves rustling, all the normal sounds that had been absent in the clearing. Relief flooded through me until I tried to orient myself. Nothing looked familiar. I'd entered the clearing from the east, I was certain of that. The sun had been behind me, filtered through the canopy, but definitely behind me. I'd run straight back the way I came, but the trees here were different. Younger, more spread out. The undergrowth was wrong too, full of plants I didn't recognize, with leaves that seemed too glossy, too perfect, like plastic replicas. My phone remained dead. The compass I always carried spun lazily, unable to find north. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking, trying to ignore how the shadows fell at angles that made no sense given the time of day. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. My watch had stopped at 2:47, the second hand twitching back and forth between the 7 and 8 like a dying insect. The forest grew denser again, but not in any pattern I understood. Sometimes I'd push through undergrowth so thick I could barely move, then suddenly emerge into sections where the trees stood in perfect rows, evenly spaced like an orchard. The temperature fluctuated wildly, Arctic cold in sunny patches, sweltering heat in the shade. Eventually, through pure luck or some remnant of instinct, I found something familiar, the hill that led down to my village. Relief nearly brought me to my knees. I could see the church steeple in the distance, the red roofs of houses, the normal, sane geometry of human civilization. That's when the forest went silent again. Not gradually, the way it had near the barn. This was instantaneous, like someone had thrown a switch. Every sound ceased mid-note. A bird's call cut off halfway through. The wind simply stopped. Even my own ragged breathing seemed to make no sound, though I could feel air moving in and out of my lungs. Then I heard the footsteps. They started far behind me, maybe 50 yards back. Deliberate, measured steps, heavier than any human should make. The rhythm was wrong too. Step, step, pause, step, 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 pause. Like whatever walked was still learning how. Twigs snapped under its weight with sharp cracks that somehow penetrated the silence while nothing else could. I didn't look back. I walked faster. The footsteps matched my pace. I broke into a jog, then a run. Behind me, the footsteps accelerated too, maintaining that same awful rhythm but faster now, covering more ground with each stride than seemed possible. Then came the grunts, low, guttural sounds that no human throat should make. They had a liquid quality, as if something was speaking through water or blood, trying to form words but lacking the proper anatomy. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my vision tunneling, my legs moving on pure terror. The village grew closer, but so did those footsteps, so did those wet, choking grunts that almost sounded like laughter now, or maybe crying, or maybe both at once. The tree line was just ahead, 20 yards, 10, 5. I burst out of the forest and into the meadow above the village. The moment my feet hit the grass beyond the trees, everything stopped. The footsteps, the grunts, the oppressive silence. All of it vanished like it had never been. Normal sounds flooded back. A dog barking in the distance, cars on the main road, wind chimes from someone's garden. I turned around, my chest heaving. The forest looked completely normal. Peaceful even. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, and I could see birds moving in the branches. Nothing followed me out. Nothing stood at the tree line. It was just trees, the same trees I'd known all my life. But as I stood there trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of panic-induced hallucination, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. My shadow was wrong. The sun was behind me, casting my shadow toward the forest. But there were two shadows, mine, and something else standing directly behind it. Something taller. Something that didn't match any shape that should exist. When I spun around, nothing was there, just empty air and grass and the normal geometry of the world. I walked home slowly, checking behind me every few steps. The shadow followed, sometimes mine, sometimes not quite mine, sometimes accompanied by others that had no source. By the time I reached my house, the sun was setting, and I couldn't tell which shadows belonged and which didn't. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left the house since. I've tried to research the trail, the barn, anything that might explain what I experienced. The trail was closed in 1994 after a series of incidents that no one will specify. The local historical society has no record of any barn in that part of the forest. The protected land has been undeveloped since the 1800s. But late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm trying to sleep, I hear things. Footsteps in the hallway that match that wrong rhythm. Breathing that's too deep, too wet. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in windows or mirrors, there's something behind me that shouldn't be there. Something that's almost human-shaped, but not quite. Something that's learning how to look like it belongs. The doctor says it's stress. Hallucinations brought on by panic in the woods, perpetuated by lack of sleep and anxiety. She prescribed pills that make everything fuzzy around the edges, but don't stop the sounds, don't fix the shadows, don't explain why my watch still twitches between 2:47 and 2:48. I want to believe her. I want to believe that minds can break in precise, specific ways that create consistent delusions. I want to believe that the wet breathing I hear right now, just outside my bedroom door, is only in my head. I want to believe that the doorknob isn't really turning, that those aren't real footsteps approaching my bed with that same horrible rhythm. Step, step, pause, step, 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 pause. But believing would mean I'm insane, and if I'm not insane, then something followed me home from that barn. Something that wasn't quite finished learning how to be. Something that's getting better at it every day. The footsteps have stopped right beside my bed now. The breathing is so close I can feel moisture in the air. I won't look. If I don't look, maybe it's not real. If I don't look, maybe I'm just crazy. The bed just shifted, like something sat down on the edge. I'm going to look. I have to look. God help me. I'm going to. Story 2. First time I heard my wife bolt upright in bed, gasping in the darkness, I thought she'd had another nightmare. But when she grabbed my arm with trembling fingers and whispered that someone was calling for her, I knew this was different. It had been 3 weeks since our daughter left for her semester abroad, and the house felt wrong without her constant chatter and music bleeding through the walls. My wife had always been a light sleeper, but lately she'd been waking at the slightest sound, the furnace clicking on, branches scraping the roof, the settling of old wood. This time, though, her eyes were wide with something beyond simple startlement. She insisted she'd heard 2 voices, both calling Mom, from different parts of the house. One from downstairs, maybe the kitchen, the other from the hallway just outside our bedroom door. Both at the exact same moment, like an echo that had somehow preceded itself. I told her it was just the wind carrying sounds from the neighbors' houses. Or maybe she'd been dreaming and the voices followed her into waking. But even as I said it, I noticed how the air in our bedroom felt heavy, charged with that peculiar electricity that comes before a storm, though the night outside was clear and still. The next evening, our son came to me while I was checking emails in my study. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot the way he did when something was bothering him, but he wasn't sure how to articulate it. Finally, he told me about hearing laughter by the swing set. Not normal kid laughter, but something thin and hollow, like it was coming through water. He'd looked out his window but seen nothing in the dying light except shadows stretching long across the grass. That night, he dreamed of laughter again, waking with tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't remember why he'd been crying. Our dog, usually lazy and content to spend her evenings sprawled on the living room rug, had taken to pacing the perimeter of the backyard with her nose to the ground. She'd follow invisible trails that led nowhere, circling the same spots over and over until the grass wore thin. Sometimes she'd stop and stare at empty air, her hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in her throat. The fence stake by the back corner, the one I'd hammered in myself last spring, was flipped upside down one morning, not knocked over or pulled out, but carefully reversed, the pointed end reaching toward the sky like an accusation. When I tried to fix it, the wood felt cold despite the warm sun, and my hands came away smelling of something sweet and rotten, though the steak looked clean. My wife started keeping a journal of the incidents. Little things that might mean nothing on their own, but together formed a pattern we couldn't quite see. Doors we were certain we'd locked standing open. Items moved slightly. A coffee mug turned so its handle faced the wrong way. Books reshelfled spine in. Family photos tilted at precise angles. The thermostat constantly resetting itself to 54 degrees, no matter how many times we changed it. She showed me an entry from Tuesday. Heard breathing in the walls, not the furnace. Too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone trying to match my own breath. Another from Thursday. Found muddy footprints in the upstairs hallway. Small, like a child's. But we haven't had rain in 2 weeks. I wanted to dismiss it all as stress, as the mind playing tricks in a too empty house. But then I started noticing things too. Shadows that lingered a beat too long after I turned on lights. The sensation of being watched from corners where nothing could hide. A presence that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of perception, patient and waiting. The breaking point came on a Sunday night. My wife was at her book club, and our son was sleeping over at a friend's house. I was alone except for the dog, who'd been restless all evening, whimpering at doors and windows. Around midnight I heard it clearly. 2 voices calling Dad from different floors of the house. Not my son's voice, not any voice I recognized, but something that approximated the sound without truly capturing it, like an AI trying to mimic human speech, but getting the emotional resonance all wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding space. Nothing. But the air grew thicker with each room I checked, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. In the basement, I found another fence stake driven into the concrete floor. Impossible, but there it was, pointing downward as if indicating something beneath. When I touched it, images flashed through my mind. Our house, but not our house. Rooms that existed in the same space but slightly shifted, like double-exposed photographs. And in those rooms, shadows that moved with purpose, reaching toward the thin places where one reality pressed against another. I yanked my hand back and the visions ceased, but the knowledge remained. We weren't alone, had never been alone. Something dwelt in the spaces between, in the overlap of here and there, feeding on the small disturbances it created, growing stronger with each acknowledgement of its presence. My wife found me sitting on the basement floor an hour later, staring at the stake that shouldn't exist. She didn't ask questions, just helped me to my feet and led me upstairs. We didn't talk about what I'd experienced, but I saw in her eyes that she knew, had perhaps always known on some level, that our house contained more than just our family. We moved our son's bed into our room that night, the 3 of us huddled together like ancient humans around a fire, seeking safety in proximity. The dog slept pressed against the door, occasionally growling at sounds we couldn't hear. In the morning, we'd find the fence stake gone from the basement, no hole in the concrete to mark where it had been. The only evidence would be the faint smell of wet earth and something else. Something sweet and wrong that clung to our clothes and hair no matter how many times we washed them. We don't talk about leaving. We know somehow that it wouldn't matter. Whatever has noticed us, whatever calls to us in voices that almost belong to us, it isn't tied to the house. It's tied to the knowing, to the acknowledgement that reality is thinner than we pretend, that things slip through the cracks all the time, and sometimes they follow you home. Now when my wife wakes in the night, I pretend to sleep. When our son mentions strange sounds or dreams that feel too real, I change the subject. When the dog tracks invisible things through our yard, I look away. Because the only protection we have is willful ignorance. The desperate hope that if we don't feed it with our attention, it might grow bored and seek other prey. But late at night, when the house settles into its deepest quiet, I hear them still. Voices that aren't quite right, calling names that belong to us but sound foreign in their mouths. They're getting better at mimicking us, learning our patterns, our inflections. Sometimes I wonder if one day I'll answer without thinking, and what might happen if I do. Sometimes I wonder if I already have, And this growing sense of wrongness, this feeling that our lives have shifted slightly off track, is the result. Maybe we're already living in that double-exposed photograph, that overlapped reality where things that shouldn't exist drive stakes into concrete floors and leave muddy footprints in bone-dry hallways. The journal my wife keeps has grown thicker. Yesterday I found an entry in handwriting that looked like hers but felt different. Letters formed with too much pressure, words chosen with an intelligence that understood meaning but not context. The family sleeps but does not rest. The watchers wait but do not hunger. The threshold thins with each passing night. When I showed it to her, she claimed no memory of writing it. But her hands shook as she tore out the page and burned it in the sink. And afterward, she held me so tightly I could barely breathe. Our daughter calls from abroad sometimes, her voice tinny and distant through the computer speakers. Last week she asked why there was someone standing behind me in the video call, someone tall and indistinct, whose face the camera couldn't quite resolve. I turned, saw nothing, turned back to find her face pale with worry. We told her it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But after the call ended, I noticed the fence stake had returned, standing upright in the corner of the room like it had always been there. When I blinked, it was gone, but the impression remained burned into my retina, a vertical line dividing my vision, separating what is from what shouldn't be. The dog won't go in the backyard anymore. Our son has stopped mentioning his dreams, but I see the dark circles under his eyes, the way he flinches at sudden movements. My wife and I move through our days like actors who've forgotten their lines, improvising normalcy while something watches from the wings, waiting for us to break character. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the barrier grows thinnest, I sometimes think I understand what wants in, what calls to us with borrowed voices and leaves signs we're not meant to comprehend. It's not malevolent exactly, just fundamentally incompatible with our reality, like oil trying to mix with water, creating disturbances at every point of contact. But understanding doesn't bring comfort. If anything, it makes it worse, because now I know that our acknowledgement has created a door that can't be closed, a connection that strengthens with each passing day. We've become antenna, receiving signals from somewhere else, and the static is slowly driving us mad. Or maybe just driving us somewhere else, somewhere that looks like here but isn't, where fence stakes grow from concrete and voices call from every direction at once. I keep thinking about that first night, when my wife heard the voices calling for her. If we just ignored it, dismissed it completely instead of investigating, cataloging, acknowledging, would we be free? Or were we always meant to be found, to be chosen as the point where two worlds briefly, terribly touch? The fence stake is back again. This time it's in our bedroom, leaning against the wall like it belongs there. My wife hasn't mentioned it, and neither have I. We step around it, careful not to touch it, careful not to look at it directly. But I know we both feel its presence, a splinter of wrongness that proves we're no longer entirely in the world we started in. Tonight I know I'll hear the voices again. They're getting clearer, more convincing. Sometimes I have to check that our son is really in his bed, that my wife is really beside me, because the voices sound so real, so much like them calling from impossible distances. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I hear a third voice I almost recognize, one that sounds like me but isn't, calling from somewhere I haven't been yet but might be heading toward, one misplaced fence stake at a time. Story 3. The dog knew before we did. I should have paid attention when Max crawled under the couch that first morning, his massive German Shepherd frame somehow compressing itself into that impossible space. He'd never hidden from anything in his 7 years of life. Not thunderstorms, not fireworks, not even that time a bear wandered into our old backyard. But there he was, 70 pounds of trembling muscle, whimpering at shadows I couldn't see. My wife called it stress from the move. She was probably right. Moving across 3 states with a dog and 2 newly adopted kittens would unsettle any creature. The kittens, barely 8 weeks old, had taken to the upstairs immediately, which seemed like a good sign until I found them on the landing that afternoon, backs arched into perfect crescents, hissing at absolutely nothing. Their tiny bodies vibrated with a primal fear that made my skin crawl. The house itself seemed ordinary enough. A two-story Victorian rental on the outskirts of town, painted that specific shade of weathered gray that suggested neglect rather than charm. The landlord, an elderly woman who conducted the entire transaction through her nephew, had been eager to rent it below market value. We didn't question our good fortune. We should have. It was the third night when I first heard it. A rhythmic creaking from upstairs, like someone slowly rocking in an old chair. My wife slept through it, exhausted from unpacking, but I lay there listening to that measured sound. Creak, pause, creak, pause. It had a deliberate quality that made my chest tighten. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, armed with nothing but my phone's flashlight, the sound stopped the moment my foot touched the bottom stair. The upstairs hallway stretched longer than it should have, or maybe that was just my imagination working overtime in the darkness. 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all empty except for our boxes. I checked each room methodically, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Just our unopened moving boxes, and that peculiar smell old houses have. Dust and forgotten years and something else I couldn't quite identify. The last room, the one at the end of the hall that we designated as storage, had its door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open, and my phone's light swept across the empty space, catching something that made my breath catch. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair. We hadn't put it there. It wasn't ours. The chair itself was unremarkable, ladder-back design, dark wood worn smooth by countless hands. But the floor beneath it told a different story. A perfect circular groove had been worn into the hardwood, as if the chair had been spinning on one leg for hours, maybe days. Fresh sawdust gathered in the groove's depths, so fine it drifted in the air when I knelt to examine it. The wood smelled newly cut, impossibly fresh for a floor that had to be decades old. I reached out to touch the chair, and my hand stopped inches away. The air around it felt wrong, dense and cold and somehow occupied. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Previous tenants must have left it. The floor damage could be old, just disturbed by our moving. The sawdust might be from something else entirely, but my body knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to leave that room, to leave that house, to get my family away from whatever had worn that groove into the floor. Instead, I grabbed the chair and carried it to the garage. It was heavier than it looked, and touching it made my palms itch with a sensation I couldn't describe. I told myself I'd call the landlord in the morning, ask about it casually. I didn't tell my wife. There was no point in worrying her over what was probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The next few weeks brought a cascade of small wrongnesses that accumulated like snow before an avalanche. Pictures would be found face down on their shelves each morning, though we never heard them fall. The kittens refused to go upstairs anymore, and Max had taken to sleeping in our bedroom closet, pressed against the back wall. My wife mentioned feeling watched while showering, said she'd started keeping the curtain partially open so she could see the bathroom door. Then came the voices. The first time, I was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. My wife had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, and the house felt too empty, too quiet. I was scrubbing a pan when I heard someone call my name from upstairs. Not loudly, just conversational, as if confirming I was home. I shut off the water, listened. Nothing. I called out, asking if someone was there, feeling foolish but needing to hear my own voice in that oppressive silence. The response came from directly behind me, so close I felt breath on my neck. A low chuckle that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite anything I could categorize. I spun around to an empty kitchen, my hands dripping soapy water onto the linoleum. Max was cowering under the dining table, his eyes fixed on something just over my shoulder. That night, I brought the chair back from the garage. I don't know why. It felt like something that needed to be done, like refusing would be worse than compliance. I placed it exactly where I'd found it, in that worn circular groove, and went to bed. The spinning started at 3 a.m. I lay in bed, paralyzed not by fear, but by a horrible fascination, listening to that rhythmic scraping as the chair rotated on one leg. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Continuous now, not like the rocking I'd heard before. My wife stirred beside me but didn't wake. I wanted to get up, to go see what was happening, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only lie there, counting rotations, until dawn finally broke and the sound stopped. When I checked the room that morning, the groove was deeper. Fresh sawdust covered the floor in a perfect spiral pattern, as if scattered by centrifugal force. The chair sat innocently in the center, and when I looked closer, I saw something that made my hands shake. There were fingernail marks on the armrests, fresh ones. The wood was gouged with parallel scratches, as if someone had gripped the chair while it spun, holding on against some terrible force. I took pictures. I needed evidence that this was really happening, that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I looked at them later, the images showed only an empty room. No chair, no groove, no sawdust. Just bare floorboards and morning sunlight. The house began to feel hostile after that. Doors would slam when there was no wind. The upstairs hallway developed cold spots that raised goosebumps on exposed skin. We started finding dead insects arranged in perfect circles. Flies, beetles, spiders. Always in groups of 7. Always in rooms we'd just left. My wife grew thin and anxious. She jumped at shadows, kept all the lights on at night. She said she'd been having dreams about spinning, about being trapped in something that wouldn't stop turning. I didn't tell her about the chair. I couldn't explain why I kept returning it to that room each time I tried to throw it away, why I felt compelled to place it just so in that ever-deepening groove. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I'd taken a sick day from work, unable to face another night of no sleep. I was dozing on the couch when I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, deliberate steps that moved from room to room. Then voices, multiple voices, engaged in what sounded like an animated conversation. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of speech, the rise and fall of what might have been an argument. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and climbed the stairs. The voices grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the storage room. I pressed my ear against the door and heard something that made my blood turn to ice water. One of the voices was mine. It was having a conversation with something that responded in tones too low to be human, a rumbling bass that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. My voice, or the thing that sounded like me, was pleading, bargaining, offering things I couldn't quite hear. The other voice just laughed, that same horrible chuckle I'd heard in the kitchen weeks ago. I threw open the door. The room was empty except for the chair, but it was wrong, all wrong. The chair was suspended 3 feet off the ground, rotating slowly on that single leg, defying every law of physics I understood. The groove in the floor had become a spiral, carved deep into the wood, extending outward in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. And in the chair, somehow both there and not there, sat a figure I couldn't quite see, couldn't quite comprehend. It turned toward me, and I saw my own face reflected in eyes that weren't eyes, weren't anything that should exist in this reality. It smiled with my mouth and spoke with my voice, but the words came out backwards, inside out, saying things that made perfect sense and no sense at all. It told me about the spinning, about how every house has a room that turns, about how some doors open both ways if you know the right rotation. It explained that I'd been here before, would be here again. That time was just another circle wearing grooves in the universe's floor. I ran. I grabbed my wife, our pets, whatever I could fit in the car, and we left that afternoon. She didn't question it, just nodded when I said we couldn't stay. I think she'd been waiting for me to say it, had maybe been seeing her own impossible things in her own impossible moments. The landlord didn't argue when we broke the lease. Her nephew seemed relieved, actually, and mentioned something about the house being difficult to keep occupied. He refunded our deposit in full, in cash, as if eager to conclude any connection between us and that property. We found a new place 3 towns over, a modern apartment with no history, no character, no rooms that shouldn't exist. Max emerged from under furniture after a week. The kitten started playing again, My wife stopped checking behind shower curtains. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. That measured scraping, like wood against wood, like something rotating in a space between spaces. I'll jolt awake and find myself standing in our living room, my hand extended toward an empty spot where a chair might sit, where a chair should sit, where a chair is sitting in another version of this room, in another turn of the spiral. My wife found the pictures on my phone yesterday, the ones I took of the empty room that should have shown the chair. She asked why I had 17 photos of nothing, why they were dated from next month, why they showed a room we'd never been in, that looked exactly like a room we'd lived in for a year. I told her it must be a glitch, a technical error, something rational and explainable. But when I looked at them again, really looked, I saw it. In the corner of each image, barely visible, was a shadow that didn't match anything in the frame. A shadow of someone sitting, gripping armrests, as something spun and spun and spun. Last night, I found fresh sawdust on our apartment floor. Just a little pile, perfectly circular, as if scattered by centrifugal force. I vacuumed it up, said nothing, pretended not to notice the way Max had started hiding under the couch again. This morning, there was more. The groove is starting to form. Story 4. The apartment in Hachioji had a private staircase that wound up like a spine through the building's core. I should have known something was wrong when the landlord wouldn't meet my eyes during the tour, his fingers drumming against his thigh in an anxious rhythm that matched neither his words nor his forced smile. But I was 21 and desperate. The rent was impossibly cheap for a place with an attic, and the semester was starting in 3 days. The previous tenant had left suddenly, the landlord explained, gesturing vaguely at the freshly painted walls that still reeked of chemicals. Personal reasons, he'd muttered, already backing toward the door. The first night, I attributed the unease to unfamiliarity. Every apartment has its own language of creaks and settling sounds, I told myself, unpacking my books in the narrow living room. The attic stairs groaned overhead even when I wasn't climbing them, but old wood does that. The walls seemed to lean inward slightly, creating shadows that pooled in corners like stagnant water. But that was just the architecture. The air tasted metallic, coppery almost, but the paint was fresh. It was the doorknob that started it all. I was lying on my futon 3 nights in, scrolling through my phone in the blue-white glow of the screen, when I heard it. A violent rattling, metal against metal, as if someone was shaking the front door with both hands. Not knocking, attacking. The sound was wet somehow, desperate, like drowning fingers clawing at a ship's hull. I froze, thumb still poised over my screen. The rattling intensified, the entire door frame seeming to vibrate. Through the thin walls, I could hear it echoing up the private staircase, multiplying into a dozen phantom hands all grasping, twisting, pulling. Then silence. I waited, counting my heartbeats. 10, 20, 50. The door exploded open. No, that's not right. It didn't explode. It simply opened. Violently. Impossibly. The deadbolt I'd carefully turned was somehow undone, the chain I'd latched hanging loose. Cold air rushed in from the stairwell, carrying the scent of rain though the forecast had been clear. I scrambled to the doorway, my bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. The staircase stretched down into darkness, the automatic light that should have triggered mysteriously off. Nothing. No one. Not even the sound of retreating footsteps. I slammed the door shut, turned the lock, set the chain, and dragged my desk chair to wedge under the handle. Then I sat on my futon, back against the wall, and waited for dawn. The hyperventilation started the next evening. I'd managed to convince myself that the door incident was a draft, a failure of old hardware, my imagination amplifying normal sounds. I'd even laughed about it with classmates, turning fear into anecdote. But when I climbed my private staircase after classes, key in hand, my chest began to tighten. It wasn't gradual. One moment I was breathing normally, the next I was gasping, lungs refusing to fill despite gulping air. My vision tunneled, edges going yellow, not gold or amber, but the sick yellow of old teeth, of infection, of things rotting from the inside. The staircase stretched impossibly upward, each step multiplying into 10, 20, 100. I collapsed on the landing, clawing at my collar. The yellow deepened, spreading like spilled turmeric across my vision. And in that yellow haze I felt it. A presence. Not watching exactly. Waiting. As if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to cross the threshold. The sensation passed after 5 minutes that felt like hours. I sat on the landing, drenched in sweat, trying to understand what had happened. Panic attack, obviously. Stress from the new semester. The strange incident with the door had affected me more than I'd admitted, but it happened again the next day, and the next, always on the staircase. Always that sick yellow creeping into my vision. Always that feeling of something waiting, patient and horrible, just beyond the door. I started timing my returns, sprinting up the stairs and into the apartment before the sensation could take hold. Sometimes I made it, sometimes I didn't, ending up gasping on the landing while other tenants stepped around me with averted eyes. They knew something. They all knew something. The worst part was inside the apartment. The hyperventilation would stop, but the feeling remained. A weight in the air like the pressure before a storm. Every corner seemed to harbor shadows that moved independently of their sources. The attic stairs creaked constantly now, a rhythm that sounded almost like footsteps pacing, pacing, pacing. I stopped sleeping properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence lean closer, its attention focusing like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. But this wasn't warm. It was cold. A cold that seemed to radiate from inside my bones. I'd wake gasping, that yellow tint fading from my vision like a departing fever dream. My grades began to slip. Friends commented on the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd flinch at sudden sounds. I couldn't explain that my apartment had become a living thing, that crossing my own threshold felt like entering the mouth of something vast and patient and hungry. The breaking point came 3 weeks in. I'd managed to avoid the apartment for 2 days, sleeping in the university library, showering at the gym. But I needed clean clothes, needed my textbooks, needed to pretend everything was normal. The hyperventilation hit me at the building entrance this time. I hadn't even reached my private staircase when my chest seized, lungs refusing their basic function. The yellow rushed in like a tide, and in that sickly light, I saw, or thought I saw, something at the top of my stairs. A shape that might have been human once, head tilted at an angle that necks don't support, watching me with eyes that weren't there. I ran, abandoned my bicycle, my dignity, everything, and ran through the streets of Hachioji until my legs gave out in a small park. An elderly woman found me there, sobbing and shaking, unable to explain why I couldn't go home. She was the one who told me about the previous tenant. Her nephew had known him, she said, settling beside me on the bench with the careful movements of age. A young man, about my age, who'd lived in the apartment with the private staircase in the attic. He'd complained about noises, about feeling watched, about a yellow tint to everything when he was home. The neighbors had thought he was having a breakdown. Stress from his studies, they'd assumed. They'd found him 3 months ago. In the apartment. In my apartment. She didn't say how he died, but the way she pressed her lips together, the way her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, told me enough. The landlord had renovated immediately. New paint, new fixtures, everything to erase what had happened. But you can't paint over that kind of thing. It soaks into the walls, into the air, into the spaces between molecules. I went to a temple the next day. The monk listened to my story without judgment, nodding as if he'd heard it all before. He agreed to come to the apartment, to perform a ritual for the spirit that might be lingering. The ceremony was simple: incense, chanting, an offering of rice and water. The monk moved through each room with practiced efficiency, his voice steady and hypnotic. When he reached the spot where I'd been sleeping, where my futon lay, he paused. His chanting grew louder, more insistent. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums. Then it was over. The monk packed his things, accepted my donation, and left with only one piece of advice whispered at the door. Sometimes, he said, the living leave marks deeper than the dead. That night I slept in the apartment for the last time. The hyperventilation didn't come on the stairs. The door remained closed and locked. The yellow tint was gone from my vision. But the presence, that waiting, watching presence, had changed. It wasn't gone. It had simply accepted something, acknowledged something, like a negotiation had been completed that I wasn't party to. I lay on my futon, staring at the ceiling, and felt it there in the darkness. Not threatening anymore, but expectant, as if it was waiting for me to understand something, to realize something, to remember something I'd never known. That's when I noticed the stains. In the darkness, barely visible, there were patterns on the ceiling above my futon. They hadn't been there before, I was certain of that. Or had they? My memory felt suddenly unreliable, full of gaps and contradictions. The stains looked like water damage, but they formed shapes that almost resolved into meaning. Letters, maybe. Or a face. Or both. Or neither. I turned on my phone's flashlight, and the stains vanished. Turned it off, and they returned, clearer now. They seemed to pulse with their own sick light, that familiar yellow creeping into their edges. And in that yellow glow, I saw, or imagined or remembered, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The previous tenant's face, looking down at me from the ceiling. Not angry, not sad, but patient. Eternally patient. Waiting for something I couldn't name. I moved out the next morning, breaking my lease, forfeiting my deposit. The landlord didn't argue, just nodded wearily and had my things on the curb within an hour. As I carried the last box down the private staircase, I looked back once at the door to the apartment. It was open. I knew I'd locked it, but it stood open, revealing the dark interior. And in that darkness, just for a moment, I saw myself, still unpacking, still settling in, still believing that paint could cover what had soaked into those walls. The hyperventilation stopped the moment I left the building. The yellow tint faded from my vision. My chest loosened, lungs remembering their purpose. But sometimes, lying in my new apartment across the city, I wake with that familiar pressure in my chest, that yellow creeping into the edges of my vision. And I wonder if I ever really left that apartment in Hachioji, or if part of me is still there, unpacking boxes in an endless first night, while something patient and terrible rattles the doorknob, waiting to be let in, or out. I can never quite remember which. The monk had been wrong about one thing. The living don't leave marks deeper than the dead. The living and the dead leave the exact same marks, because sometimes, in that space between breathing and suffocating, between sleeping and waking, between the yellow and the dark, they're the same thing. And sometimes, when I pass a window or a mirror, I see my reflection tilt its head at an angle that necks don't support, and I wonder which side of that door I'm really on. I don't go back to Hachioji anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I get calls from an unknown number. When I answer, there's only breathing, shallow, desperate, hyperventilating gasps. It sounds like someone drowning in yellow air, someone trying to warn me about something. It sounds exactly like me. Story 5. The shadow first appeared on a Tuesday night in October, though I wouldn't understand its significance until much later. I'd been living in that top-floor apartment for 3 months by then. Mom and I had moved in during the summer, drawn by the surprisingly low rent and the expansive view of the city. The landlord had mumbled something about the building's history when we signed the lease, his eyes never quite meeting ours, but desperate people don't ask many questions. We needed a fresh start after Dad left, and this place, perched on the 8th floor of a crumbling brick building, seemed like it could offer that. What the landlord hadn't mentioned was that our building stood directly adjacent to Greenwood Cemetery, its ancient headstones visible from my bedroom window like broken teeth jutting from diseased gums. Nor had he mentioned the murders. 7 of them, all within a 3-block radius, all unsolved, all from the 1970s. I learned about those from our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 doors down and seemed to subsist entirely on green tea and local gossip. But none of that mattered at 2:17 a.m. on that October night when I first saw it. I'd woken with the familiar pressure in my bladder, stumbling through the darkness toward the bathroom. Our apartment had these enormous windows, floor to ceiling, that Mom loved during the day, but which transformed into black mirrors at night. As I passed the living room, movement outside caught my eye. Not unusual in itself. The city never truly slept, and lights from neighboring buildings often created illusions in the glass. This was different. Against the amber glow of the streetlights below, a shape hung suspended between our building and the one across the alley. At first, my sleep-addled brain processed it as laundry. Someone's sheets blown loose and tangled on a wire. But laundry doesn't move with such deliberate purpose. Laundry doesn't have the proportions of a human body. The figure swayed gently, perhaps 20 feet from my window, suspended from what looked like a utility wire. Its form was entirely shadow, darker than the night around it, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. Where a face should have been, there was only deeper darkness. Yet somehow, impossibly, I felt it watching me. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A tarp, a banner, some kind of art installation. But my body knew better. Every hair on my arms stood at attention, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears like a warning drum. The shadow tilted its head, or what might have been its head, and I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over Mom's ceramic vase. When I looked again, the wire was empty, swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Over the following weeks, the shadow became my unwanted companion, always at the same time, somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., always on that wire. I tried staying awake to catch its arrival or departure, but exhaustion would claim me, and I'd jerk awake to find it already there, swaying in its hypnotic rhythm. I tried sleeping through, setting no alarms, but my body had developed its own internal clock, dragging me from sleep at precisely the wrong moment. Mom noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd drift off during dinner, how I'd taken to drinking coffee by the pot. She attributed it to teenage hormones and academic stress, prescribing early bedtimes and vitamin D supplements. I couldn't tell her the truth. How could I explain that something hung outside our window each night, something that shouldn't exist but did? The running started 3 weeks after my first sighting. It was a Saturday night, technically Sunday morning, 2:43 a.m. according to my phone. I'd been watching the shadow for nearly half an hour, trying to discern any features, any hint of what it might actually be, when the first footstep thundered overhead. Our apartment was on the top floor. Above us lay only the roof, accessible through a locked maintenance door that supposedly hadn't been opened in years. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the heavy rhythmic impact of someone running. Not just running, but sprinting with desperate urgency. The footsteps traveled the length of the building, maybe 60 feet, then stopped abruptly. Silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then they started again from the original position, as if whoever was up there had teleported back to their starting point. This pattern repeated for 2 hours. Run, stop, reset. Run, stop, reset. The shadow on the wire never moved during these episodes, maintaining its gentle sway, as if conducting an orchestra, only it could hear. Mom woke during the third repetition, appearing in my doorway with worried eyes. "What is that noise?" We stood together in the living room, both of us staring at the ceiling as the footsteps pounded overhead. In the window's reflection, I could see the shadow still hanging outside, and I wondered if Mom could see it too. But her gaze remained fixed upward, her expression cycling through confusion, annoyance, and something that looked unsettlingly like recognition. She called the building supervisor the next morning. Mr. Rodriguez arrived within an hour, master key in hand, and led us to the roof access door. The lock was covered in rust, clearly undisturbed for months if not years. When he finally managed to force it open, we climbed the narrow stairs to find nothing. The roof stretched before us, empty except for some old HVAC equipment and a few weather-beaten lawn chairs someone had abandoned long ago. No footprints in the layer of dirt and debris, No sign anyone had been there recently. But Mr. Rodriguez's face had gone pale. He muttered something about checking the security cameras and hurried us back downstairs. We never heard what those cameras showed, if anything. The running continued every night thereafter, always beginning around 2:30 a.m., always lasting exactly 2 hours. Other tenants started complaining. Mrs. Chen mentioned it during one of her tea-fueled gossip sessions, her voice dropping to a whisper as she spoke of the building's history. Not just the murders in the neighborhood, but something about the original owner, a man named Walsh who'd hanged himself from the roof's water tower in 1963. "They say he still runs," she said, clutching her teacup with trembling fingers. "Every night, trying to escape whatever drove him to that rope. But there's no escape when you're already dead." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but the evidence mounted. Other tenants reported seeing shadows where shadows shouldn't be. The couple in 7B swore something knocked on their window at midnight. Impossible, given they too faced the alley with nothing but empty air beyond their glass. The family in 6F moved out after their teenage daughter claimed to see a figure standing in their hallway, watching her sleep. Mom and I couldn't afford to move. We were trapped by economics as surely as by whatever haunted this place. The knocking started on my window 2 months after that first sighting. Always at midnight, exactly 3 raps, deliberate and patient. The shadow on the wire would be gone during these moments, and I'd lie frozen in bed, covers pulled to my chin, as something tested the glass's strength. The knocking never varied. 3 raps, then silence. But each night, it seemed to grow slightly louder, as if whatever knocked was learning how much force the window could withstand. I installed a camera, hoping to capture evidence, something to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The footage showed only darkness and the reflection of my own terrified face. Audio picked up the knocking, but it sounded different on playback, less like knuckles on glass and more like the creaking of rope under strain. Mom started sleeping in my room after the 4th night of knocking, dragging her mattress across the hall without explanation. We'd lie side by side in the darkness, both pretending to sleep, both listening to the sounds that shouldn't exist. Neither of us spoke about it during daylight hours, maintaining a desperate fiction that everything was normal. But normal had become a foreign concept. I started seeing the shadow during daylight hours, brief glimpses in peripheral vision, a darkness that didn't belong. It appeared in reflections, in the gaps between buildings, in the corner of my eye during class. My grades plummeted. Friends stopped calling after I canceled too many plans, unable to explain why I needed to be home before dark, why I couldn't stay out past midnight. The research became my obsession. I spent hours in the library, combing through old newspapers, city records, anything that might explain what was happening. The murders from the 1970s all had one thing in common. The victims had lived in buildings along our street. All had been found in their apartments, doors locked from the inside, no sign of struggle. The cause of death was listed as undetermined in each case, though one detective's notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, mentioned that all victims had been found with their eyes wide open, expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The building's history proved even more disturbing. Before the apartments, it had been a boarding house. Before that, in the 1920s, it had served as an overflow facility for the psychiatric hospital 3 blocks away. The basement, now used for storage, had once held cells for the violently disturbed. Mr. Walsh, the man who'd hanged himself, had been both owner and patient. He'd inherited the building from his father, but had spent 3 years as an inmate in his own property before his release in 1962. The records were vague about his condition, mentioning only persistent delusions and nocturnal disturbances. I found his photograph in a 1961 newspaper article about the hospital's closure. Even in the grainy black and white image, his eyes held a familiar darkness, the same void I saw nightly in the shadow on the wire. The revelation should have brought clarity, but it only deepened my confusion. Was I seeing Walsh's ghost? Was the building itself somehow infected by the madness it once contained? Or was I following in the footsteps of those who'd lived here before, my mind fracturing under the weight of suggestion and sleep deprivation? Mom found my research one evening, the papers spread across my desk like evidence of my own deteriorating sanity. She sat on my bed, shoulders sagging, and finally spoke the words we'd both been avoiding. "You see it too, don't you? The thing on the wire?" The admission should have been a relief, but it felt more like a confirmation of doom. If we both saw it, it was either real or we were both losing our minds. Neither option offered comfort. She told me she'd been seeing it since the second week after we moved in, had been hearing the running for even longer. She'd hoped it was just her imagination, stress from the divorce and the move. But when I started showing signs, the exhaustion, the nervous glances at windows, the way I'd stopped going out after dark, she knew. "The landlord warned me," she admitted, voice barely a whisper. Not directly, but he mentioned that sensitive people sometimes had issues with the building. I thought he meant the noise from the street, maybe drafts from old windows. We made a pact that night to endure it together, to not let it drive us away or drive us mad. We'd survived Dad's abandonment. We could survive this. But even as we held each other, I could feel the shadow watching from beyond the glass, patient as death itself. The breaking point came on a December night when the temperature plummeted and ice formed on the windows. I woke not to knocking but to the sound of scratching, long, deliberate scrapes across the glass like fingernails or claws. The shadow wasn't on the wire. Instead, it pressed against my window, its darkness spreading across the glass like spilled ink. Mom was already awake, standing in my doorway with a baseball bat she'd bought the week before. We watched together as the darkness tested every inch of the window, searching for weakness. The scratching grew more insistent, more desperate, and I could swear I heard breathing, ragged, labored gasps of something that had been running for decades without rest. The window began to crack, just a small fracture at first, spiderwebbing from the point of contact. The darkness seemed to pulse with excitement, pressing harder, and the crack spread. Mom grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed by what I saw in that spreading darkness. Not emptiness, but depths, layers upon layers of shadow, each containing a suggestion of form, of faces, of all those who'd lived and died in this place. The crack reached the window's edge, and I knew with terrible certainty that when it shattered, something would enter that could never be expelled. But just as the glass began to bow inward, the darkness retreated. It pulled back like a tide, condensing into that familiar humanoid shape before dissolving entirely. The window held, though the crack remained, a permanent reminder of how close we'd come to something irreversible. We left the next morning, abandoning most of our possessions, taking only what we could carry. Mom used her credit cards to get us a hotel room, then another, then a small studio apartment on the other side of the city. We never returned to retrieve our things. But geography provides no escape from some things. I still wake at 2:17 a.m. every single night, my body conditioned by those months of terror. I check windows compulsively, searching for shadows that don't belong. Mom does the same, though we never discuss it. We maintain our fiction of normalcy, pretending we're not both waiting for the knocking to resume. Because it will resume. I know this with the same certainty I know my own name. Whatever we encountered in that apartment, ghost, demon, psychic residue, or shared delusion, it marked us, changed us. We're connected to it now, and distance is just a temporary reprieve. Sometimes on very quiet nights, I swear I can hear running in the distance, footsteps pounding on some eternal roof, searching for an escape that doesn't exist. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I glimpse a familiar shadow swaying on wires that shouldn't be there. The locals were right about one thing. It's never physically harmed anyone. It doesn't need to. The terror itself is enough. The slow erosion of sanity. The gradual acceptance that reality isn't what we thought it was. We're all hanging from our own wires, swaying in winds we can't see, waiting for something to cut us loose or reel us in. I've started researching our new neighborhood, checking old newspapers and city records. There have been no murders here, no psychiatric hospitals, no documented hauntings. But that means nothing. Every place has its shadows if you look long enough. its secret history of madness and despair. Or maybe we brought it with us. Maybe it was never tied to that building at all, but to us, to our fear, our vulnerability, our willingness to see darkness where others see only empty air. Maybe everyone has their own shadow on the wire, their own midnight knocker, their own eternal runner. Most people just have the wisdom not to look. But I looked. We both did. And now we can never stop looking, never stop listening, never stop waiting for that shadow to find us again. Because it will find us. It always does. The wire stretches between all places, all times, and something walks along it in the darkness, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when we finally understand what it wants, what it's always wanted, for us to join it, to hang beside it in that space between buildings, between sleep and waking, between sanity and madness, to finally stop running and accept that some things can't be escaped, only embraced. I see it now, even as I write this, swaying gently outside my new window, waiting, always waiting, and one night I know I'll open the window and ask it inside. Because the real terror isn't that it might be real. The real terror is that I'm starting to hope it is. Story 6. The first time my dog barked that night, I barely registered it. I was deep into a true crime documentary, the blue glow of the television washing over my living room in waves. But when the barking stopped as suddenly as it had started, something made me look up. There he was, tail wagging, tongue lolling out in that stupid, happy way dogs have when they've accomplished something important. Except he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the ceiling, at the exact spot where my bedroom floor would be. "What is it, boy?" I asked, muting the TV. The sudden silence felt heavy, like wet wool pressed against my ears. That's when I heard it, a distinct bump from upstairs, followed by what sounded like fingernails dragging across wood. My office chair, the one with the distinctive creak that had annoyed me for years, groaned as if someone had just settled into it. I lived alone. The rational part of my brain immediately started cataloging explanations. Old house, settling foundations. Maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten into the attic, but my dog, usually brave to the point of stupidity, pressed himself against my leg, a low whine building in his throat. His tail had stopped wagging. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept behind the couch, a relic from my college days that had collected dust for a decade. Each step up the stairs felt like a betrayal of some fundamental survival instinct. The hallway stretched before me, darker than it should have been. Had I turned off the bathroom light? I couldn't remember. My office door stood ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The hinges had always been loose. I'd been meaning to fix them for months. Through the gap, I could see my desk lamp casting long shadows across the wall. Had I left it on? The day blurred together in my mind, work from home bleeding into evening, one endless stretch of screens and conference calls. I pushed the door open with the bat. Empty. The chair sat exactly where it should be, turned slightly toward the window as I always left it, but the air felt wrong, thick and expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. Cologne. Not mine. Something expensive and old-fashioned, like my grandfather used to wear before he died. My dog refused to enter the room. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house became footsteps. Every whisper of wind through the vents became breathing that wasn't my own. Around 3 a.m., I heard my dog padding around downstairs, his nails clicking on the hardwood. Except when I looked down at the foot of my bed, he was there, curled up and snoring softly. The clicking stopped. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I worked from the kitchen instead of my office, keeping my laptop positioned so I could see both the stairs and the back door. My dog stayed close, following me from room to room with an anxiety that matched my own. I installed a security app on my phone, connected to the cameras I'd bought months ago but never set up. The afternoon was spent running wires and adjusting angles, telling myself this was just a precaution, that I wasn't actually afraid of my own home. That evening I decided to test a theory. I closed every door in the house, taking pictures with my phone to document their positions. I locked windows, drew curtains, created a controlled environment where any change would be immediately obvious. My dog watched me with what I could have sworn was concern, his head tilted in that way that made him look almost human. By 10 o'clock, I was in the bathroom, door locked, running water for a shower I desperately needed. The exhaustion of the previous night was catching up with me, making my movements slow and clumsy. Steam filled the small space, fogging the mirror until my reflection became a ghost of itself. That's when I heard it, that unmistakable creak from my bedroom, just on the other side of the wall. The chair. Someone was sitting in my desk chair. I turned off the water, my hand shaking as I reached for the faucet. In the sudden silence, I could hear everything: the drip of water from the shower head, the hum of the overhead fan, and beneath it all, the rhythmic creaking as someone rocked back and forth in my chair. Back and forth, back and forth. My phone was in the bedroom. The baseball bat was downstairs. I stood there naked and dripping, feeling more vulnerable than I had ever felt in my life. The doorknob was cold under my hand, slick with condensation from the steam. I couldn't bring myself to turn it. The creaking stopped. Then, so close to the door that they could have been leaning against it, someone laughed. Low and soft, almost affectionate, like they were enjoying a private joke. The handle rattled once, gently, as if someone was testing it. I must have stood there for an hour, maybe more, water pooling around my feet, my skin prickling with cold. When I finally found the courage to open the door, the bedroom was exactly as I'd left it. The chair faced the window. The security app showed nothing, just me entering the bathroom at 10:03 p.m. and emerging, pale and shaking, at 11:47 p.m. The 30 minutes of footage in between showed an empty bedroom, a still chair, a dog sleeping peacefully on the bed. But I knew what I'd heard. The next few days became a game of documentation and doubt. I recorded everything, every sound, every movement, every instance of my dog barking at nothing. I set up motion sensors, installed more cameras, even bought an EMF detector off the internet that arrived with instructions in broken English. My work suffered. Sleep became something that happened in short bursts on the couch, always with one eye open, always with my phone recording. The evidence was maddeningly inconsistent. Sometimes the cameras would capture what looked like shadows moving independently of any light source. Other times, they showed nothing while I clearly heard footsteps above me. My dog's behavior grew increasingly erratic, barking at empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms, then acting perfectly normal as if nothing had happened. I started researching the house's history, diving into property records and old newspaper archives. Built in 1947, nothing remarkable. A family of 4 in the 50s, an elderly couple through the 70s and 80s, then a series of short-term renters before I bought it 5 years ago. No murders, no tragedies, no reason for whatever was happening to be happening, unless it wasn't the house, unless it was me. The thought crept in during one of my 3 a.m. vigils, watching the security feeds on my laptop while my dog whined in his sleep. What if I was having some kind of breakdown? The isolation of working from home, the stress of the past few years, the lack of real human contact beyond video calls and grocery store interactions. What if it had finally broken something in my mind? I made an appointment with my doctor, described the symptoms in clinical terms: auditory hallucinations, paranoia, disrupted sleep patterns. She prescribed something for anxiety, recommended a therapist, looked at me with the kind of professional concern that made me feel like a specimen under glass. The pills made everything feel muffled and distant, but the sounds continued. If anything, they got worse. A week into the medication, I woke up to find every door in the house open. Not just ajar, fully open, as if someone had methodically gone through and pushed each one as wide as it would go. The security footage showed me doing it, walking through the house at 2:17 a.m. with mechanical precision, opening each door with deliberate care. I had no memory of it. The therapist suggested stress-induced parasomnia, sleepwalking brought on by anxiety and exhaustion. It made sense. explained everything in neat medical terms. Except it didn't explain the cologne smell that still lingered in my office, or the way my dog would sometimes stare at something just behind me, his hackles rising, or the fact that even when I was absolutely, certainly awake, I could still hear that chair creaking in the next room. I started leaving the house more, working from coffee shops and libraries, only returning to sleep. But even that became unbearable. The feeling of being watched followed me, intensified when I was away, like something was angry that I'd left. I'd return to find subtle changes. A book moved slightly on the shelf, a glass in the sink I didn't remember using, my computer awake when I knew I'd shut it down. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to communicate. I set up a recording device in my office, asked questions to the empty room. Who are you? What do you want? Why are you here? The playback revealed nothing but my own voice, increasingly unhinged, talking to silence. But at the very end, just barely audible, there was something else. Not words exactly, but a pattern in the static that sounded almost like breathing. My dog started sleeping in the basement, as far from my bedroom as he could get. The breaking point came 3 weeks after that first night. I was in bed, not sleeping, but not quite awake, existing in that liminal space where reality becomes negotiable. The chair was creaking again, but this time it was moving. I could hear it rolling across the floor, the wheels catching on the edge of the rug. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, coming from the office, having a conversation I'd had 3 days ago with my mother, word for word, inflection for inflection, even the laugh I'd forced when she'd asked if I was taking care of myself. But underneath my voice was another sound, a low humming, almost melodic, like someone was enjoying the performance. I grabbed my phone, started recording, but the moment I moved, everything stopped. The playback showed only silence and darkness. The security app had mysteriously crashed at 2:33 a.m., all cameras offline until I manually restarted them at 2:45 a.m. 12 minutes of missing time, 12 minutes where anything could have happened. I called my mother the next morning, tried to casually bring up our conversation. She was confused. We hadn't talked in over 2 weeks. The call log on my phone confirmed it. The conversation I'd heard repeated back to me had never happened, or had happened, but not in any way I could prove. The therapist increased my medication. My doctor ordered blood work, brain scans, looking for tumors or chemical imbalances that might explain what she carefully called persistent perceptual disturbances. Everything came back normal. Frustratingly, maddeningly normal. I stopped telling people what was happening. The look in their eyes, pity mixed with fear, was worse than the isolation. Even my closest friends started finding excuses not to visit, their texts growing shorter and less frequent. I couldn't blame them. I wouldn't want to be around me either. But here's the thing that haunts me more than any unexplained sound or impossible movement. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, in the most ordinary moments, I catch myself humming. That same melodic pattern I heard under my recycled conversation. I don't remember learning it, don't know where it comes from, but it feels familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. Like muscle memory for something I've never done. Last night I found a notebook in my office filled with my handwriting. Pages and pages of the same sentence. The house is listening. I don't remember writing it. The security footage from that time shows me asleep on the couch downstairs. My dog was with me, also asleep. We were alone in the house. We're always alone in the house, aren't we? This morning I woke up in my office chair. My dog was sitting in the doorway, watching me with eyes that seemed too knowing, too human. For just a moment, I could have sworn he smiled. Not a dog smile, all teeth and enthusiasm, but something else. Something that knew a secret it would never tell. The chair creaked as I stood up, that familiar sound that had terrorized me for weeks. But this time, it didn't sound like an intrusion. It sounded like home, like something settling into place, like a conversation I'd been having with myself all along, in a language I'm only just beginning to understand. I've stopped taking the medication, canceled the therapy appointments, removed the cameras, Whatever's happening, whether it's in the house or in my head, fighting it only seems to make it stronger. Maybe acceptance is the key. Maybe madness is just another way of being sane. My dog barks less now. Sometimes late at night, I hear him padding around the house, and I know if I looked, he'd be right beside me. But I don't look anymore. Some things are better left unconfirmed. The chair is creaking again as I write this. I'm not in my office. I'm in the kitchen, alone, typing on my laptop while my dog sleeps at my feet. The sound is coming from upstairs, rhythmic and patient, like someone rocking themselves to sleep, or like someone waiting for me to finally understand what they've been trying to tell me all along. I think I'm beginning to understand. I think I've always understood. The house isn't haunted. It's listening. And maybe, just maybe, I'm finally learning how to speak its language, or it's learning to speak mine. The distinction doesn't seem to matter anymore. Tomorrow, I'm going to sit in that chair and rock back and forth, and see who answers. Maybe it will be me. Maybe it's always been me. Maybe that's the secret my dog has been trying to tell me with those two human eyes. That the stranger in my house wears my face, speaks with my voice, and has been here all along, waiting patiently for me to remember who I really am. The cologne smell is stronger now. I recognize it finally. It's the same brand my grandfather wore, the same bottle I bought last month but don't remember buying, sitting unopened in my medicine cabinet. Or it was unopened. I just checked, and it's half empty, though the receipt in my drawer is dated yesterday. Yesterday when I was 60 miles away visiting my mother for the first time in 2 weeks. Or was I? The house knows. The house is listening, and sometimes, in the space between heartbeats, I swear I can hear it breathing. Story 7. The spoon hit the floor at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I had been lying awake, staring at the green glow of my alarm clock, counting the minutes since I'd last heard something shift in the darkness of my childhood home. The metallic clatter came from the kitchen, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the silence like a blade through fabric. Not the gentle slip of silverware sliding from a wet dish rack. No. This was a spoon that had traveled, that had moved. I didn't get up to check. I hadn't gotten up to check for the past 3 weeks, not since I'd returned to my mother's house after her stroke left her in a rehabilitation facility 40 miles away. The doctor said she'd need months of recovery. The house, they said, couldn't sit empty. Someone needed to water the plants, collect the mail, make sure the pipes didn't freeze as autumn crept toward winter. What no one told me was that the house had developed habits of its own. The first incident happened on my second night back. I was sorting through old bills in the living room when a red balloon, one of those cheap latex things, half deflated and left over from some forgotten celebration, drifted across the room. Not bobbed, not rolled. Drifted, as if carried by an invisible current, moving from the corner near the bookshelf to the opposite wall with the kind of slow, purposeful trajectory that made my throat tighten. I sat frozen, a phone bill from 2019 crumpling in my grip, and watched it complete its journey. The windows were shut. The ceiling fan was off. The air in the room was thick and still, carrying that particular mustiness of spaces occupied by the elderly, mothballs and lavender and something faintly medicinal underneath. The balloon came to rest against the baseboard and stayed there, its wrinkled red skin catching the lamplight. I told myself it was a draft. Old houses have drafts. The walls breathe, the foundations settle, and sometimes things move in ways that seem inexplicable but aren't. I'd been living in a modern apartment for 8 years. I'd simply forgotten how these old bones creaked and sighed, but I didn't touch the balloon. I left it there, pressed against the wall like something waiting. The laundry room was worse. It sat at the back of the house, past the kitchen, a narrow space with a single high window that let in gray afternoon light. My mother's ancient washer and dryer hunched there like sleeping animals, and the air always smelled of detergent and damp concrete. I went in 3 days after the balloon incident to wash some towels. The light was off when I entered. I was certain of this, certain enough that I reached for the switch on the wall. But before my fingers made contact, something flickered in my peripheral vision. A strobe of brightness, there and gone, originating from somewhere near the dryer. I stood with my hand raised, heart suddenly loud in my ears. Another flash, brief, sourceless, illuminating the cramped space in a burst of white that left purple afterimages swimming across my vision. Then, nothing. The room returned to its gray dimness, the washer and dryer silent and still. I didn't do laundry that day. I drove to a laundromat in town instead, feeding quarters into machines while trying to convince myself that old electrical systems could spark, could short, could produce light without reason. This was an explanation. This was rational. But when I returned home, I found myself hesitating at the laundry room door, listening for something I couldn't name. The chairs started moving on the 5th day. I came downstairs one morning to find one of the kitchen chairs pulled out from the table, angled toward the window as if someone had been sitting there, watching the backyard. I pushed it back. That evening, it was out again, this time facing the hallway that led to the stairs. I checked the floor for scratches, for some evidence that the chair was simply sliding on the old linoleum. The floor was level. The chair had rubber feet. There was no reason, no physical, mechanical reason, for it to move. On the 7th day, I woke to find 2 chairs out, positioned facing each other like seats arranged for a conversation. The sight of them, so deliberate in their placement, sent a cold thread of unease through my chest that I couldn't shake for hours. I pushed them back. I wedged them under the table. I even placed a heavy cookbook on one seat, as if weight could anchor the inexplicable. The next morning, the cookbook was on the floor, and the chair was by the back door, pulled close to the window there, its back to the rest of the house. I should tell you that I've never believed in ghosts, not in the way some people do, the way that allows for seances and spirit boards and grainy photographs of floating orbs. My mind has always been stubbornly empirical, demanding evidence, rejecting claims that couldn't be tested and repeated. Even as a child in this house, surrounded by my mother's superstitions and her whispered stories of omens and portents, I'd rolled my eyes and looked for logical explanations. But logic was beginning to feel like a language I was forgetting how to speak. The door chimes were the detail that started to genuinely unnerve me. My mother had installed them years ago. A string of small brass bells hung on the inside of the front door, designed to jingle when someone entered. A security measure for a woman living alone, she told me. She wanted to know when the door opened, even if she was in another room. The bells had started ringing without the door moving. The first time, I was in the kitchen making coffee. The bright, tinkling sound made me turn so fast I knocked the coffee pot against the counter. I walked to the front door, my bare feet cold on the hardwood, and found it firmly closed, deadbolted, chain-latched. The bells hung motionless. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. Then I reached out and flicked one with my finger, producing the exact sound I'd just heard. Something had touched these bells. Something had made them ring. The second occurrence happened 2 days later, while I was sitting in the living room reading. The chime came, delicate, almost playful, and I didn't bother getting up. I just sat there, book open in my lap, listening to the dying echo of bells that had no reason to sound. By the 4th time, I'd started talking to the empty air. "I know you're doing this," I said, feeling foolish, feeling desperate, feeling something else I couldn't quite identify. "I don't know what you want, but I know you're here." The house offered no response. The bells hung silent. The afternoon light slanted through the curtains, illuminating dust motes that drifted with no apparent wind. I began keeping a journal, not of the events themselves. I didn't want to create a record that might later seem like evidence of delusion, but of my own mental state. I noted my sleep patterns, my appetite, my mood. I was looking for signs that I was unwell, that the stress of my mother's illness had fractured something in my mind that was now producing hallucinations, false perceptions, breaks from reality that manifested as floating balloons and moving chairs. The journal entries were frustratingly normal. I was sleeping 6 to 7 hours a night. I was eating regular meals. I had moments of sadness about my mother's condition, certainly, but nothing that suggested clinical depression or the kind of psychological disturbance that might explain what I was experiencing. I called a friend from college one evening, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, but who I remembered as possessing a reassuring skepticism about all things supernatural. I described the events in the house, trying to keep my voice light, trying to frame them as amusing oddities rather than genuine concerns. He listened, then laughed. "Old houses are weird," he said. "My grandmother's place used to do stuff like that all the time. Doors opening by themselves, lights flickering. It's just settling and bad wiring and your imagination filling in the gaps." "Right," I said. "That's what I figured." But after we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of the living room and thought about the word imagination. Was that what this was? Was I watching a balloon drift and a chair move and somehow constructing a narrative that didn't exist? Was the spoon in the kitchen, the one I'd found in the middle of the floor that morning, 3 feet from the sink where I'd left it, simply a product of my own distracted placement? I couldn't be certain anymore. That was the worst part. I couldn't trust my own perception of events. The house grew heavier at night. That's the only way I can describe it. A sense of weight, of presence, of the air becoming denser as the sun went down. I found myself turning on every light, filling the rooms with brightness that pushed back against something I couldn't see. I kept the television on for background noise, the canned laughter of sitcoms creating an illusion of company. But the sound still came. A creak on the stairs when I was in the kitchen. A soft thump from the laundry room. The delicate rattle of the door chimes at odd hours. I started sleeping with the bedside lamp on, its warm glow a thin barrier against the darkness that pressed at the windows. I dreamed of my mother in this house, younger, moving through rooms that were both familiar and strange, talking to someone I couldn't see. In the dreams, she would turn to me and say something, but the words were always lost, swallowed by the strange acoustics of sleep. I would wake with the sense of having missed something important. 3 weeks in, I made a decision. I would document the next event, properly, empirically, with evidence. I set up my laptop in the kitchen, its camera facing the table and chairs. I placed the spoon in the exact center of the sink and marked its position with a piece of tape. I closed all the windows, turned off all the fans, and created conditions that should have made any movement impossible. Then I went upstairs to read, leaving the camera recording. 2 hours later, I returned. The laptop's battery was dying. I'd forgotten to plug it in, but there was still enough charge to review the footage. I sat at the kitchen table and pressed play, watching the static image of the sink and chairs. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The frame was utterly still. Then, at the 23-minute mark, one of the chairs began to slide. It was gradual, so gradual that I almost missed it. A centimeter at first, then another, the movement smooth and deliberate, as if guided by hands I couldn't see. The chair slid away from the table, rotating slightly as it went, until it came to rest facing the camera. Facing me. I stopped the video, rewound, played it again. The movement was unmistakable. The chair moved on its own, with no visible cause, no vibration, no disturbance to explain it. I had evidence. I had proof. But proof of what? That night I lay in bed and listened to the house breathe around me. The settling of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant call of a night bird in the trees outside. Normal sounds. The sounds of a structure aging, of systems functioning, of life continuing its unremarkable course. And underneath it all, something else. A rhythm I couldn't quite catch. A presence I couldn't quite confirm. I thought about my mother, lying in her hospital bed 40 miles away. I thought about how she'd lived in this house for 50 years, how she'd raised me here, how she'd grown old within these walls while I'd gone off to build a life elsewhere. Had she experienced these things? Had she sat in this darkness and listened to the same sounds and wondered if she was alone? Had she made her peace with whatever shared this space? I thought about calling her, asking. But what would I say? "Mother, are there ghosts in your house?" She was recovering from a stroke, her speech still halting and effortful. This wasn't a conversation she needed to have. Besides, I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The night before I decided to leave, the bathroom mirror fogged while I was brushing my teeth. The exhaust fan was on. The door was open. There was no heat, no steam, nothing that should have produced condensation on the glass. But as I stood there, toothbrush frozen mid-stroke, I watched the mirror cloud over from the edges inward, obscuring my reflection until I was looking at a blank gray surface. And in the center of that grayness, a shape began to form. Not a face, not a hand, nothing so defined. Just a suggestion, an outline of something standing where nothing should be, its edges blurred by the fog, its presence undeniable even as its form refused to resolve. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood there, toothpaste dripping into the sink, and watched the shape in the mirror. It didn't move either. It simply was, occupying space that should have been empty, existing in a way that my rational mind screamed was impossible. Then, slowly, the fog began to clear. The mirror returned to normal, showing me my own pale face, my own wide eyes, my own reflection, and nothing more. I rinsed my mouth and walked out of the bathroom, my steps measured and deliberate. I didn't run. I refused to run. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the doorframe. I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles away. My bag is packed, my car is gassed up, and tomorrow I'll make arrangements for a property management company to handle the house until my mother is well enough to make decisions about its future. I don't know what I experienced in that house. I've turned the question over in my mind 1,000 times, examining it from every angle, and I still can't reach a conclusion that satisfies me. Was it supernatural? Was it psychological? Was it some combination of the two? My stressed mind interpreting random events as meaningful patterns, constructing a haunting where none existed. The video on my laptop shows a chair moving with no visible cause. That's a fact. But facts can be interpreted in many ways, and I'm no longer sure I trust my ability to interpret anything. What I know is this. There are things in that house that move. Balloons drift across still rooms. Spoons travel from sinks to floors. Chairs arrange themselves in configurations that suggest intention, purpose, awareness. And if I stayed any longer, I think I would have started moving too. Not physically. The house never threatened me, never pushed or pulled or forced. But mentally, spiritually, whatever part of me believed in a solid, predictable world would have begun to slide, to shift, to relocate itself into the cracks and shadows where something else already lived. My mother will recover. She'll return to that house and resume her life among the things that move. And maybe she'll tell me about it someday. The accommodation she's reached, the understanding she's forged with the presences that share her walls. Or maybe she won't. Maybe she'll smile and change the subject and leave me wondering if I imagined everything, if the weeks I spent in her home were just a strange dream, brought on by stress and exhaustion. I don't know anymore. I don't know what's real. And sitting here in this anonymous motel room, listening to the ice machine hum and the highway traffic drone in the distance, I find myself straining to hear something beneath the noise. A shift, a whisper, a single brass bell, ringing softly in the dark. Story 8. The floorboards in this house have never stopped speaking. I noticed it the first night we moved in, a language of creaks and groans that seemed deliberate, almost conversational, as though the wood itself was discussing our arrival. My mother dismissed it as settling, the natural complaints of a structure built in the 1880s, handed down through our family since my great-grandmother purchased it after the war. But I've lived here for 7 months now, and I've learned that some sounds don't belong to physics. Some sounds belong to something else entirely. I am 23 years old, and I am losing my mind. Or perhaps I am finally seeing clearly. The distinction has become irrelevant. The house sits at the end of a gravel road, 3 stories of Victorian architecture wrapped in peeling white paint, and widow's walks that overlook nothing but Pennsylvania farmland. My mother inherited it when her aunt passed, and after her divorce, after everything fell apart, she saw it as a refuge, a place to rebuild. She didn't tell me about the history then. She didn't tell me that her best friend had died here, in the upstairs bedroom that now serves as my study. She didn't tell me about the previous owner, the old woman who spent her final decades alone within these walls, who died in the master bedroom where my mother now sleeps. She didn't tell me because she didn't think it mattered. I remember the first time I felt watched. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of night where darkness arrives early and settles like a weight. I was reading in the parlor. We still call it that, using the old language of the house, when the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible. I looked up from my book, and in the doorway to the kitchen, I saw her, a woman, brown hair falling past her shoulders, eyes so blue they seemed to hold their own light. She was waving at me, a slow, deliberate gesture, like someone greeting an old friend through a window. I blinked, and she was gone, leaving only the empty doorway and the distant sound of something shifting in the walls. I didn't tell my mother, not then. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, the stress of relocation, the way isolation can play tricks on perception. But that night, lying in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door, measured, unhurried. The weight of them suggested someone substantial, someone real. But when I opened the door, flashlight trembling in my hand, there was nothing but empty corridor and the faint smell of lavender. The footsteps came at 3 a.m. They always come at 3 a.m. Weeks passed. The encounters accumulated like sediment, each one depositing another layer of unease. I began keeping a journal, partly to track the phenomena, partly to prove to myself that I wasn't inventing memories. The human mind is unreliable. I know this. I studied psychology for 2 years before dropping out, before the anxiety became too much, before I retreated to my mother's side like a wounded animal seeking familiar warmth. But a journal doesn't lie, and my journal tells me that on November 3rd, I saw the old woman for the first time. She was standing at the foot of my bed when I woke, hunched and spectral, wearing a nightgown that might have been white once but had yellowed with age or death or something between. Her face was a geography of wrinkles, her eyes sunken and dark, and she was watching me with an expression I can only describe as hunger. Not malevolent hunger, something sadder, more desperate, the hunger of someone who has been alone for too long. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And then she smiled, a terrible stretching of papery skin, and she dissolved into the shadows like smoke dispersing in wind. I told my mother about that one. I had to. She found me at the kitchen table at 4 a.m., drinking whiskey I'd stolen from her cabinet, my hands shaking so badly that the glass rattled against my teeth. She sat across from me, and in the harsh overhead light, I saw how tired she looked, how thin she'd become, how the house was wearing her down too. She told me then about the previous owner, the old woman who had lived here for 40 years, who had died in the master bedroom, who had been found only when the smell became impossible to ignore. She told me she sometimes felt a presence near her bed at night, a weight at the edge of the mattress, as though someone were sitting there, watching, waiting. I asked her why she hadn't mentioned this before we moved in. She said she didn't want to scare me. She said she thought maybe the house just needed new life in it. She said a lot of things that sounded like justification. I described the woman I'd seen in the parlor doorway, the brown hair, the blue eyes, the wave. My mother went very pale. She left the kitchen without a word and returned with a photograph, a small snapshot, edges curling with age. 2 young women with their arms around each other, grinning at the camera with the invincibility of youth. One of them was my mother, decades younger. The other was the woman I had seen. Every detail precise, every feature exact. The woman who had died in my study 15 years ago, long before I ever set foot in this house. Her name was one I'd never heard. Her face was one I'd never seen. And yet she had waved at me like I was an old friend. The kitchen became the center of the phenomena. I don't know why. Perhaps because it was the heart of the house, the place where meals had been prepared for over a century. where life had been sustained. At night, long after my mother and I had gone to bed, the sounds would begin. Cabinets opening and closing, drawers sliding on their tracks, the distinctive clatter of silverware being sorted. Once, the unmistakable crash of a plate shattering on tile. I went downstairs to investigate. I always went downstairs. Some compulsion drove me, some need to understand, to document, to prove that I wasn't simply unraveling. The kitchen was empty. The cabinets were closed. Every plate was intact, stacked neatly in the cupboards. But the air was thick with the smell of cooking. Roast meat and fresh bread and something sweet, like pie crust browning in an oven. The smell of a meal that had been prepared decades ago, lingering like a ghost itself. I stood in that kitchen until dawn, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but when I finally returned to my room, I found my journal open on my desk, pages flipping slowly as though moved by a breeze. All the windows were closed. The phenomena began to focus on my mother. She started sleeping poorly, waking with bruises she couldn't explain, scratches on her arms that appeared overnight. She blamed the antique bed frame, the rough edges of the headboard, but I saw the fear in her eyes. She was lying to herself the way I had lied to myself, constructing explanations that crumbled under the weight of evidence. Then came the handprint. I was in the kitchen making coffee when she walked in, still in her robe, moving stiffly as though in pain. She asked me to look at her back. She said something had touched her in the night, something cold, something that had pressed against her with terrible purpose. I lifted her robe, and there it was, a handprint, vivid red against her pale skin, the fingers splayed wide, the impression so clear I could count the lines of a palm. It was not her hand. The shape was wrong, the fingers too long, too thin. It was not my hand either. I pressed my own palm against it to compare, and the mismatch was undeniable. Something in this house had touched my mother. Something with hands. Something that wanted us to know it was here. I began to hear voices, whispers mostly, coming from the walls, from the floor, from the empty spaces between moments. I could never quite make out the words, but the tone was clear, pleading, insistent, sometimes angry. I would be reading or cooking, or simply staring out the window at the endless fields, and the whispers would start, threading through my thoughts like parasites. I stopped sleeping. Sleep meant vulnerability. Sleep meant the 3 a.m. Footsteps, the old woman at the foot of my bed, the brown-haired visitor waving from doorways. I drank coffee until my hands trembled constantly. I walked the halls at night, flashlight in one hand, journal in the other, documenting every sound, every temperature drop, every fleeting shadow. My mother suggested I see someone, a doctor, a therapist, someone who could help me process what was happening. But how could I explain to a stranger that the house was alive with the dead? How could I describe the way the air changed when they were near, growing thick and cold and electric? How could I make anyone understand that I wasn't imagining these things, that the evidence was real, that the journal didn't lie? I saw more of them as the weeks wore on, not just the brown-haired woman, not just the old owner. Others, a young woman in a dress from another century, standing in the garden at dusk. A shape in the mirror that wasn't my reflection, gone when I turned to look. Figures at the edge of my vision, always moving, always just out of focus. The house had many ghosts, or I had many fractures in my mind. The distinction had become irrelevant. Last night, I made a decision. I sat my mother down at the kitchen table, in the same spot where she had shown me the photograph, and I told her everything. Every encounter, every whisper, every moment of mounting terror that I had been too afraid or too proud to share. I showed her my journal, page after page of documentation, and I watched her face change as she read. She wasn't surprised. She had known. She had always known. The house had been speaking to her too, in its own way. The presence at her bedside, the feeling of being watched, the inexplicable certainty that we were not alone. She had simply chosen to ignore it, to push it down, to pretend that silence was the same as safety. I told her that I thought we needed to leave, not permanently. Perhaps there was no permanent escape from whatever had attached itself to us, but for a while, long enough to clear our heads, long enough to determine whether the phenomena followed us or remained bound to these walls. She agreed. She cried. She held my hand across the table and told me she was sorry for bringing me here, for thinking that a haunted house could be a home. We began packing this morning, but as I sealed boxes in my study, the room where my mother's friend had died, I felt the temperature drop. I smelled lavender, and when I turned, the brown-haired woman was there, standing by the window, her blue eyes fixed on me with an expression I had never seen before. Sadness, yes, but also warning, also fear. She was trying to tell me something. Her mouth moved, shaping words I couldn't hear, and her hands gestured urgently toward the floor, toward the walls, toward the hidden spaces of this ancient house. Then she was gone, and I was alone with my racing heart and my trembling hands, and the absolute certainty that leaving would not be as simple as I had hoped. I went downstairs. I told my mother what I had seen. She was pale, drawn, standing by the front door with her car keys in her hand. She said she had heard something too. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow, descending toward her even though she could see that the staircase was empty. We looked at each other. We understood, without speaking, that the house did not want us to go. I'm writing this in the car, parked at the end of the gravel road, engine running, headlights cutting through the afternoon gloom. My mother is beside me, silent, staring straight ahead. The house is visible in the rearview mirror, and I swear, I can see figures in the windows, watching us, waiting. We are going to drive away. We are going to find a motel, or a relative's house, or anywhere that isn't here. We are going to try to rebuild our lives somewhere untouched by history. But my journal is still in the study. I left it on the desk, pages open, pen beside it. And as I look at the house in the mirror, I realize that I don't remember packing it. I don't remember leaving it behind. The last entry I wrote was dated yesterday, but there is a gap in my memory, a dark space where the hours should be. What happened this morning? What did I seal in those boxes? Why can't I remember carrying them to the car? My mother reaches over and takes my hand. Her palm is cold. Her fingers are too long, too thin. And when I turn to look at her, really look at her, I see that she is smiling. A terrible stretching of familiar features, an expression that doesn't belong on her face. I close my eyes. I count to 10. When I open them, my mother is normal again, worried and tired and human. She asks me if I'm ready to go. I say yes. I put the car in drive. The house grows smaller in the rearview mirror, but the figures in the windows do not wave goodbye. They simply watch, patient and eternal, as though they know something I don't, as though they know we will be back. I grip the steering wheel and focus on the road ahead, but the whispers are still there, threading through my thoughts, and I realize with dawning horror that they are not coming from the house. They are coming from inside the car. Story 9. The heat hit me first. Not the kind of heat that greets you when you step outside on a summer afternoon. This was something else entirely. Something that had been trapped, festering, accumulating behind walls and beneath floorboards for 3 weeks. It pushed against my face like a living membrane as I crossed the threshold, and I felt the absurd urge to apologize for disturbing it. My partner stood beside me, his silhouette framed against the dying October light that struggled through the doorway behind us. We'd worked together for almost 2 years now, handling the aftermath of tragedies that most people couldn't stomach. Suicides, accidents, the occasional overdose in a studio apartment that went unnoticed until the smell reached the neighbors. But this house, this was different. This wasn't a cleanup job at all. We were here to secure the property, board the windows, padlock the doors. Make sure no curious teenagers or desperate squatters wandered into what remained of someone's life. What remained of 4 lives, if the news reports were accurate. The power had been cut weeks ago, and the late afternoon sun did little to penetrate the smoke-stained windows. I switched on my flashlight and watched the beam cut through air thick with particulates, ash, dust, and something else I didn't want to name. The walls of the foyer were streaked with black tongues of soot that licked upward toward the ceiling, and the hardwood floor groaned beneath my boots like something wounded. Upstairs is off limits, my partner reminded me, his voice muffled behind his respirator. Fire department cleared the structure, but the second floor took the worst of it. We just secure the perimeter and get out. I nodded, though he couldn't see my face in the darkness. The company had been explicit. No one goes upstairs. The insurance investigation was still pending, and the floors up there were compromised. Not that I had any desire to climb those stairs. They rose from the center of the living room like a spine, disappearing into absolute blackness above. We started with the ground floor, moving through rooms that still held the ghost shapes of furniture beneath fire-damaged tarps. The kitchen, a small study lined with bookshelves, their contents reduced to fragile rectangles of char, a half-bathroom where the mirror had cracked from the heat, fragmenting my reflection into a dozen watching eyes. It was in the dining room that I first felt it. The sensation came slowly, like cold water seeping into my shoes. A prickling awareness at the base of my skull. The absolute certainty that someone was standing just outside the reach of my flashlight, watching me with an intensity that pressed against my skin. I spun, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. Just a table surrounded by chairs, one of them toppled on its side. The chandelier above hung at an angle, its crystals smoke-dulled and silent. "You okay?" my partner called from the kitchen. "Yeah," I answered, but my voice sounded wrong in that space. Flattened, absorbed by the walls before it could properly travel. Just thought I saw something. I hadn't seen anything. That was the problem. The feeling of being observed had no source, no explanation. It simply existed. Like the heat, like the smell of old fire that clung to every surface. We continued working. I measured windows while my partner retrieved plywood from the van. The house groaned around me with each gust of wind outside, its timbers settling in ways that sounded almost deliberate, almost rhythmic. I was alone in the living room, documenting the dimensions of a large bay window, when I heard the footsteps. They came from directly above me, heavy, deliberate, the unmistakable cadence of someone walking across a floor, heel to toe, moving from one end of the room to another. The ceiling creaked with each step, dust sifting down through invisible cracks. I stopped breathing. My flashlight beam trembled against the wall as I tilted my head upward, tracking the sound as it crossed the length of the second floor. It stopped directly above me. A pause. Then it reversed direction, walking back the way it had come. "Did you hear that?" I asked when my partner returned, his arms full of lumber. He paused, listening. The house had gone silent again. "Hear what?" "Footsteps, upstairs." His eyes met mine through the plastic lenses of his mask. "Old house. They settle, make all kinds of noises." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But I knew the difference between a house settling and a person walking. The weight was different. The intention was different. We worked faster after that. The sun was setting, and neither of us had brought enough battery power to work in complete darkness. As we boarded the kitchen windows, the house seemed to darken around us with unnatural speed, shadows pooling in corners like something liquid. The temperature, impossibly, had risen. Sweat ran down my back beneath my coveralls, and my respirator grew slick against my face. That's when my partner saw it. He stopped mid-motion, a nail held between his fingers, his attention fixed on the doorway leading to the living room. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop through the floor. A shadow stood in the threshold. Not a shadow cast by something. There was nothing to cast it. This was a shape, human-sized and human-formed, occupying the space where the living room began. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, a void cut into the fabric of the air itself. And though it had no features, no face, no eyes that I could see, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at us. "You see that?" my partner whispered. It wasn't a question. The shadow didn't move. It simply stood there, existing in a way that felt fundamentally wrong, like a hole in the world that had learned to take human shape. I don't know how long we stared at it. Seconds, minutes. Time had become unreliable, stretched and compressed by fear. Then the shadow was gone, not fading, not retreating, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. My partner and I didn't discuss it. We returned to our work with a manic efficiency, neither of us willing to acknowledge what we had witnessed. To speak it aloud would make it real, and reality was already fragile enough in that house. But the house wasn't finished with us. The second shadow appeared in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. We saw it at the same moment, our flashlight beams converging on a figure that stood motionless against the far wall. This one was smaller than the first, broader. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the intersection of two flashlight beams creating an optical illusion. The human brain, patterns seeking to a fault, finding shapes in random darkness. But then it moved. The shadow took a step toward us, a single, deliberate step that produced no sound, no footfall, nothing but the visual horror of watching something impossible approach. We ran. I don't remember crossing the living room. I don't remember passing the staircase. What I remember is the sound, a crash from above, so violent and sudden that it shook the walls. Something had fallen, something massive, and with it came a scream that might have been the wind, might have been the house, might have been something I didn't want to acknowledge. We burst onto the front porch and kept moving, not stopping until we reached the van parked at the curb. The October air hit my sweat-soaked skin like ice water, and I tore off my respirator gasping, my heart a frantic animal in my chest. My partner stood beside me, his hands on his knees, breathing heavily. Neither of us spoke. Behind us, the house loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like blank eyes, its smoke-stained walls like diseased skin. "We have to go back," he finally said. I knew he was right. We hadn't finished the job. The front door was still unsecured, its padlock sitting uselessly in my tool bag, which I had abandoned somewhere in the living room. We approached the house like men walking toward an execution. The porch steps groaned beneath our weight. The front door stood open, spilling darkness onto the threshold like something bleeding out. My partner entered first. I followed close behind, my flashlight gripped so tightly my fingers ached. The living room was as we had left it. Tarps, shadows, the smell of old fire. My tool bag sat near the bay window, undisturbed. I worked quickly. The padlock assembly took less than 5 minutes, my hands moving through the motions while my eyes scanned the darkness for shapes that didn't belong. My partner stood guard at the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight pointed upward at that impenetrable blackness above. "Just finish it," he said. "Let's get out of here." I secured the final screw and tested the padlock. It held. The front door was sealed. We would exit through the kitchen and secure that door behind us. Simple, mechanical, done. We were halfway across the living room when the pounding started. It came from the front door, the door I had just padlocked. 3 heavy blows, so forceful that the wood visibly shuddered in its frame. The sound was enormous in the silence, a thunderclap of violence that echoed through the empty house. We froze. The pounding came again. 3 more blows, harder this time. The padlock rattled, the door groaned, and I watched in horror as dust sifted from the frame with each impact. "That's coming from inside," my partner whispered. "The door is padlocked from inside. Nothing can—" A third volley. The door bulged inward, straining against its hinges. And behind the violence, beneath the noise, I heard something else. Something that might have been breathing. Something that might have been a voice, low and unintelligible, speaking words I couldn't understand and didn't want to. We didn't run this time. We fled, a primal, animal flight that carried us through the kitchen, out the back door, around the side of the house, and into my partner's van. He started the engine before I had closed my door, and we were moving, the tires screaming against the pavement as we fled that street, that neighborhood, that festering wound of a house. I looked back once, just once. The front door was still closed, still padlocked. But in the bay window of the living room, I saw a figure watching us leave. A shape that was darker than the darkness around it, a void with human dimensions. It raised one hand. I turned away and didn't look back again. 3 weeks have passed since that night. I quit the job the following morning. My partner did the same. We haven't spoken about what happened, and I suspect we never will. Some experiences exist beyond language, beyond the capacity of words to contain. But I still think about it. Every night, in the moments before sleep claims me, I return to that house. I feel the heat. I smell the ash. I hear the footsteps crossing the ceiling above me. And I wonder. The fire department cleared the structure. The police investigation found nothing unusual. The house was empty, they said. Completely empty. The fire had consumed everything except the walls and the frame. Empty. But I know what I saw. What we both saw. And here's the thing that keeps me awake. The splinter in my mind that I cannot remove. The company that hired us had detailed records, insurance documents, police reports. But when I checked, when I finally worked up the nerve to verify the story we had been told, I found nothing. No news articles about a tragedy at that address. No death certificates. No investigation. According to every official record I could find, nothing had ever happened in that house. No fire. No family. Nothing. So what were we cleaning up? What were we securing? And if there was never anyone living there, if the tragedy we had been told about never occurred, then what was walking through those rooms? What was watching us from the shadows? What was pounding on that door, trying to get out of a house that had no history, no victims, no reason to be haunted? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I hear it again. That pounding, that breathing, that voice, whispering words I almost understand. And I wonder if we ever really left that house at all. Or if some part of us is still there, trapped in the darkness, pounding on a door that will never open, waiting to be let out. Story 10. I have never told anyone about that afternoon. Not my wife, not my therapist, not even my grandfather before he passed. Some memories don't belong in conversation. They belong in the dark corners of sleepless nights, where they can breathe and grow roots into the soft tissue of doubt. But I am older now, and the weight of carrying this alone has become unbearable. Perhaps writing it down will finally exorcise whatever has been living inside me for the past 37 years. I was 7 years old when it happened, though I have spent decades questioning whether it happened at all. My grandfather's property sat on the edge of the Adirondacks, a rambling 40 acres of pine forest and overgrown meadows that seemed to exist outside the jurisdiction of time. The farmhouse itself was a relic, white clapboard siding gone gray with neglect, windows that rattled in their frames like loose teeth. My parents had brought me there for 2 weeks every summer since I could walk, and I had come to know those woods the way a child knows the geography of dreams, intimately, instinctively, and with the peculiar confidence that only ignorance can provide. That particular August afternoon, the air hung thick and still, pregnant with the threat of a thunderstorm that never came. My parents had driven into town for supplies, leaving me in my grandfather's nominal care. He had fallen asleep in his armchair by noon, a half-finished crossword puzzle sliding off his lap, and I had slipped out the back door with the self-righteous certainty that I would return before anyone noticed my absence. I remember the quality of the light that day, golden and syrupy, filtering through the canopy and columns that seemed almost solid enough to touch. I followed a deer trail I thought I recognized, pushing deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured alone. The familiar landmarks began to thin, the lightning-split oak, the moss-covered boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the creek bed that ran dry every summer. Soon I was walking through territory that felt fundamentally wrong, as though the forest itself had rearranged its furniture while I wasn't looking. The first tendril of panic wrapped around my chest when I realized I could no longer hear the distant rumble of Route 9. That highway had been my compass, my constant companion humming at the edge of perception. Its absence was absolute, a silence so complete that my own breathing seemed obscenely loud. I called for my grandfather. My voice came out thin and reedy, swallowed by the trees before it could travel more than a few feet. The forest didn't echo. It absorbed. I tried again, louder this time, but the words fell like stones into deep water. That's when I noticed the trees had changed. The pines that dominated my grandfather's property had given way to something older, gnarled hardwoods with bark like cracked leather, their branches intertwining overhead to form a cathedral ceiling that blocked out all but the most determined shafts of light. I didn't recognize any of it. The deer trail had vanished beneath a carpet of dead leaves that crunched with each step, announcing my presence to whatever might be listening. I walked for what felt like hours, though my child's sense of time was unreliable at best. The light began to fail, taking on that bruised quality that precedes dusk, and I was on the verge of sitting down to cry when the trees suddenly parted. Before me stretched a pasture. I hadn't known there were any pastures on my grandfather's land, and later I would learn with unsettling certainty that there weren't. But there it was, perhaps 3 acres of overgrown grass gone to seed, hemmed in on all sides by the dark press of forest. At its center sat a house. It was modest, almost quaint. A single-story structure with a wraparound porch and curtains in the windows. Smoke curled from its chimney despite the August heat. A split-rail fence enclosed a small paddock beside the house, and inside it stood 2 horses, a gray mare and a chestnut gelding, watching me with the patient disinterest of animals who have seen everything. Relief flooded through me, powerful enough to bring tears to my eyes. People. A house meant people, and people meant directions, a phone, a way home. I stumbled across the pasture, the tall grass whispering against my legs, my lost hat falling somewhere behind me without notice. The woman was waiting on the porch when I reached the house, as though she had been expecting me. She was old, truly old, in a way that transcended mere years. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes the color of pond water in winter. She wore a dress that might have been fashionable half a century earlier, dark fabric with tiny flowers embroidered along the collar. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth were very white and very even. Too perfect, I would think later, for someone of her apparent age. She told me not to be frightened, that children wandered through these woods all the time, that she knew exactly where my grandfather's house was. Her voice had a quality I struggled to describe, warm but distant, like sunlight filtered through frosted glass. She said she would walk me to the train tracks that bordered the far edge of my grandfather's property, and from there I would find my way home easily. I asked about her horses. She said they had been with her for a very long time. When I asked their names, she tilted her head in a way that made me think of a bird studying a worm, and said that some things were better left unnamed. We walked together through the pasture, past the horses who didn't so much as twitch as we passed, and into the forest on the opposite side. The woman moved with surprising grace for someone so elderly, navigating the underbrush as though she could see paths invisible to me. She asked me questions about my parents, my grandfather, my life back home, and though I answered readily enough, I noticed that she offered nothing in return. Every query I posed about her own circumstances was deflected with a gentle smile and a change of subject. The light continued to fade as we walked, and I began to feel a peculiar drowsiness settling over me, as though the very air had thickened into something narcotic. The woman's voice seemed to come from very far away, even though she walked right beside me. At some point, I realized I could no longer feel my feet touching the ground. Then, without transition, we were standing at the edge of the train tracks. I recognized them immediately. The rusted rails, the rotting ties, the gravel bed choked with weeds. I had walked these tracks with my grandfather dozens of times. Home was less than a quarter mile away, I turned to thank the woman, but she was already retreating into the trees, her dark dress melting into the shadows. She paused at the forest's edge and looked back at me with those winter water eyes. She said I should be more careful in the future. She said the woods were full of things that did not wish to be found, and things that were very eager to find lost boys. Before I could respond, she was gone. I ran home along the tracks, arriving just as my parents' car pulled into the driveway. No one had noticed my absence. My grandfather was still asleep in his chair. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They listened with the patient skepticism adults reserve for children's fantasies. But something in my voice, perhaps the tremor I couldn't quite control, convinced them to investigate. My grandfather knew every inch of his property, and he assured us there was no pasture, no house, certainly no elderly woman living alone in the woods. But he agreed to take us on a hike to prove it. We retraced my steps as best I could remember them, pushing through the same forest that had so thoroughly disoriented me the day before. My grandfather led the way with his walking stick, pointing out landmarks I had somehow missed. The deer blind he built 30 years ago, the stone wall from a farm that predated the Civil War, the spring-fed pond where he used to fish as a boy. We walked for over an hour. Then we found the pasture. It was exactly where I remembered. The same 3 acres of overgrown grass, the same ring of ancient hardwoods pressing in from all sides. But the house was gone. The paddock was gone. The horses were gone. There was nothing but empty field, so thoroughly abandoned that even the grass seemed to have forgotten it had ever known cultivation. My father called out, his voice carrying across the stillness. No one answered. We searched the perimeter, looking for any sign of habitation, a foundation, a well, wagon ruts, anything. We found nothing. The pasture was pristine in its emptiness, untouched by human hands for what might have been decades or centuries. I was about to suggest we leave when my grandfather stooped to pick something up from the tall grass near the pasture's center. He held it up to the morning light and my stomach dropped through the floor of the world. It was my hat. The same hat I had been wearing the day before. The same hat I had lost somewhere in my desperate scramble across this very field. It was here. Which meant I had been here. Which meant... My grandfather said nothing. He simply handed me the hat and turned back toward home, his face suddenly old in a way I had never noticed before. We never spoke of that day again. Not once in the 30 years before my grandfather died. The subject simply ceased to exist, buried beneath the weight of its own impossibility. I have spent decades trying to rationalize what happened. Perhaps I imagined the house, constructed it from the raw material of fear and childhood imagination. Perhaps the woman was a hiker, a stranger passing through who led me home and vanished into the anonymity of the forest. Perhaps the hat blew there on the wind, or I dropped it on some previous visit I'd forgotten. But the explanations never quite fit. They leave gaps, loose threads that unravel the moment I pull them. I returned to my grandfather's property last fall, after it passed to me in his will. I am 54 years old now, gray at the temples, thickening around the middle, with a mortgage and a retirement account, and all the other anchors that tether adults to the illusion of a comprehensible world. I told myself I was there to assess the property, to determine whether to sell it or keep it for my own family. But I know why I really went. The pasture is still there. I found it on my 3rd day of searching, exactly where it had been 37 years ago. The same overgrown grass, the same cathedral of ancient trees, empty as a held breath. I stood at its center as the autumn light faded, waiting for something I couldn't name. The forest was silent around me. No birdsong, no wind, no distant traffic. Just the enormous, patient silence of a place that exists outside the jurisdiction of explanation. Then I heard it, the sound of horses. Distant, indistinct, but unmistakable. The soft whicker of an animal, the heavy thud of hooves on packed earth. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line, my heart hammering against my ribs with the same desperate rhythm it had known when I was 7 years old. The sounds faded as quickly as they had come. The pasture remained empty. I was alone. But as I walked back toward the house in the dying light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not with malice, nothing so simple as that. It was the patient, dispassionate observation of something that had all the time in the world, something that had been waiting for me to return. I found my grandfather's old walking stick by the back door and gripped it tight, though I couldn't say what I intended to defend myself against. That night I dreamed of the woman's face, her winter water eyes, her too perfect teeth. She stood at the edge of my grandfather's property, waiting at the place where the mowed lawn met the encroaching forest, and she smiled at me as though we shared a secret. She asked if I remembered the way home. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, and spent the remaining hours until sunrise watching the tree line through my bedroom window. Once, just as the first gray light began to seep into the sky, I thought I saw movement at the forest's edge. A dark shape that might have been a woman in an old-fashioned dress, or might have been nothing at all. The property is for sale now. I put it on the market 3 days after I returned home. My wife thinks I'm being sentimental, unable to let go of childhood memories. She doesn't know about the pasture. She doesn't know about the hat. She doesn't know that some nights I wake at 3 a.m. to the sound of horses that can't possibly exist, their hoofbeats circling my suburban house like something searching for a way in. I don't know who or what helped me find my way home that August afternoon. I don't know if I should be grateful or terrified. Perhaps both emotions can occupy the same space, like light and shadow, like the house that was there and then wasn't. All I know is that the woods remember. They remember every lost thing that has ever wandered into their depths, every child who strayed too far from the path. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, they give those lost things back. I think about that often, about giving things back, about the woman's warning, the things eager to find lost boys. I wonder now if her help came with a price I haven't yet paid, a debt accruing interest in some ledger I can't see. Last week I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned and cracked with age, depicting a farmhouse I have never seen and will never forget. A split-rail fence, 2 horses in a paddock. On the porch, barely visible in the faded image, stood a woman in a dark dress. On the back, in handwriting that trembled like old bones, were 2 words: "Come home. I haven't slept since." Story 11. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not mildew, but something older. A scent like pressed flowers left too long between the pages of a forgotten book, sweet and suffocating. My wife squeezed my hand as we stepped through the threshold, and I remember thinking, at this price, there has to be something wrong. There was. We found the house through a foreclosure listing, the kind that makes you wonder what desperate circumstances led someone to abandon everything. The previous owners had left in a hurry, the realtor explained with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. They'd taken only what they could carry. Everything else, furniture, appliances, even pictures on the walls, remained frozen in place like a museum exhibit of someone else's life. The first week we told ourselves it was a blessing. A fully furnished 3-bedroom for a fraction of what we'd budgeted. We laughed about our good fortune, unpacking our boxes around someone else's possessions, integrating our life into the skeleton of theirs. My wife found vintage dishes in the cabinets, hand-painted with delicate roses. I discovered a collection of vinyl records in the basement, jazz mostly, the kind my father used to play on Sunday mornings. It was on the 8th day that I found the journal. I was clearing out the attic, a cramped space accessible only through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, when my flashlight caught the edge of something leather-bound wedged between the rafters. The cover was cracked and water-stained, the pages yellow and brittle as dead leaves. The handwriting inside was masculine, angular, pressing so hard into the paper that I could feel the grooves with my fingertips. March 14th. She won't answer my calls. 3 weeks now. The silence is worse than screaming. March 22nd. I saw her today, across the street. Red hair catching the light like fire. She didn't see me, or pretended not to. I followed her for 6 blocks before I realized what I was doing. April 3rd. I can't sleep. When I close my eyes, I see her face. When I open them, I see her everywhere. In the grocery store, in the reflection of my television screen, standing at the foot of my bed. I'm losing control. April 15th. She came to me last night, stood in my living room without speaking. I reached for her, and my hands passed through air. I'm not well. I know I'm not well. But she was here. The entries continued, growing increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scratches. The final entry was dated April 29th, and it consisted of only 4 words repeated over and over, filling an entire page. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I showed the journal to my wife that evening. She read it in silence, her face pale in the lamplight, then handed it back to me with trembling fingers. We should throw it away, she said. Burn it. Some things aren't meant to be kept. But I didn't burn it. Instead, I placed it in my desk drawer, telling myself I'd deal with it later. That night, I dreamed of red hair spreading across white pillows like spilled wine. The music box appeared 3 days later. My wife found it while cleaning out a closet in the spare bedroom, a small wooden thing, ornately carved with roses and thorns. When she opened the lid, it played a melody neither of us recognized, something in a minor key that seemed to hang in the air long after the mechanism wound down. Beautiful, she called it. I called it something else, though I kept the word to myself. Wrong. The television started acting strangely that same week. We'd be watching a program when the screen would flicker, the channel changing on its own to static, to infomercials, to news broadcasts from decades past. Once, at 3 a.m, it turned itself on at full volume, filling the house with the roar of white noise. I found my wife standing in front of it, her eyes reflecting that grainy light, her lips moving in words I couldn't hear. She didn't remember any of it the next morning. Sleepwalking, she said. She'd done it as a teenager. Stress brought it back sometimes. I wanted to believe her. The dining room chairs began to move. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious as floating across the room, but subtle shifts that made me question my own memory. I'd push them in after dinner, aligned perfectly with the table's edge, and wake to find them scattered, some overturned, others shoved against the wall as if kicked by invisible feet. My wife blamed the floorboards, said old houses settled in strange ways, but floorboards don't leave scratches in hardwood. Floorboards don't arrange chairs in a perfect circle facing the center of the room, which is exactly how I found them one Sunday morning, the music box sitting in the middle like an altarpiece. The illnesses came next. My wife developed headaches, splitting, debilitating things that kept her in bed for days at a time. I caught a cold that transformed into bronchitis that lingered for weeks, leaving me exhausted and short of breath. Our luck soured in ways that felt personal, targeted. My car broke down twice in 1 month. I was passed over for a promotion I'd been promised. We found mold in the basement, then termites in the walls, then a crack in the foundation that would cost thousands to repair. And through it all, the sensation that we were being watched. I first noticed it in the bathroom mirror, that prickling awareness of eyes on the back of my neck. I'd turn, half expecting to find someone standing behind me, and find only empty space. But the feeling persisted, grew, spread through the house like an infection. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that dissolved when I looked directly at them. Once, crossing the hallway at night, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the living room doorway. Slight, feminine, with hair the color of autumn leaves. By the time I blinked, she was gone. I returned to the journal obsessively, reading and rereading those desperate entries until the words lost meaning. Who was the woman with red hair? What had happened to her? The author never named her, never explained their relationship, only documented his unraveling with the clinical detachment of a man watching himself drown. My wife caught me one night, hunched over the desk at 2 a.m, the journal open before me. "You need to stop," she said from the doorway, her voice strange and distant. "You're making yourself sick." I looked up, ready to argue, and the words died in my throat. She was standing in shadow, her features obscured, and for one terrible moment I couldn't recognize her. Her shape seemed wrong somehow, her outline blurred at the edges like a photograph left too long in sunlight. I blinked, and she was herself again. Tired, worried, my wife of 11 years looking at me like I was a stranger. "You're right," I told her. "I'm sorry." I closed the journal and followed her back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness listening to the house settle around us, its bones creaking and groaning, and I wondered if old houses could remember, if pain could seep into walls and floors and linger there like a stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. My wife's cousin visited in October, an unpleasant man who drank too much and laughed too loud, and spent the weekend making snide comments about our haunted fixer-upper. I found him in the spare bedroom on his last day, the music box in his hands, that strange melody filling the room. "This is worth something," he said, turning it over to examine the craftsmanship. 19th century, probably. "You should have it appraised." I told him to put it back. Something in my voice must have startled him because he set it down immediately, hands raised in mock surrender. Later, after he'd left, I noticed the music box was gone. My wife assumed we'd misplaced it during the visit. I knew better. The blanket was the last thing I found. It was folded neatly in a cedar chest at the foot of our bed, a handmade quilt, faded and threadbare, stitched with a pattern I didn't recognize. Red thread on white fabric, abstract shapes that might have been flowers, or might have been something else entirely. The moment I touched it, a chill ran through me so profound that my teeth chattered. That night, the dreams began in earnest. I dreamed of a woman with red hair standing in my living room, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I dreamed of hands closing around a throat, my hands, though they didn't feel like mine. I dreamed of the music box playing its minor key melody while someone screamed in a voice I almost recognized. I woke each morning more exhausted than the night before, the blanket somehow having migrated from the chest to our bed, wrapped around me like a second skin. My wife said I'd been talking in my sleep, but when I asked what I'd said, she only looked away. On the 1st of November, I burned the blanket. I built a fire in the backyard and fed the quilt to the flames piece by piece, watching the red thread blacken and curl. The smoke that rose smelled like that first day, pressed flowers, and something older, something that had been waiting a very long time. The house felt different after that, lighter. The headaches faded, my cough cleared. The television stopped its midnight performances, and the chairs stayed where I put them. Even the sensation of being watched diminished, though it never entirely disappeared. Some nights I still catch movement in my peripheral vision, still feel that prickling awareness of eyes on my skin. But it's muted now, distant, like a voice calling from very far away. The cousin called last month. His luck had turned, he said, and I could hear something like fear beneath his bluster. His marriage was falling apart. He'd lost his job. He'd developed a persistent cough that no doctor could explain. And he kept having dreams, he said, about a woman with red hair who stood at the foot of his bed and watched him with empty eyes. I asked about the music box. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. "How did you know?" he finally whispered. "I know because I found it in a closet when I was packing up his apartment. He'd been admitted to a psychiatric facility after a breakdown, talking to people who weren't there, they said, answering questions no one had asked. The music box sat on his nightstand, its lid open, its mechanism long since wound down. When I picked it up, that old chill ran through me again, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something. A breath, a whisper, a woman's voice saying a name I couldn't quite make out. I brought it back to the house. I don't know why. Some part of me felt it belonged here, that separating it from this place was what had caused all the trouble. I set it on the mantel in the living room, and that night, for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. I'm writing this in my study, the journal open beside me, the music box playing softly in the next room. My wife went to bed hours ago, and I should join her. But I can't stop reading these entries. Can't stop searching for answers I know I'll never find. The cousin got worse. Then he got better, then worse again. The cycle continued until his body simply gave out. Heart failure, the doctors said, though he was barely 40 and had no history of cardiac problems. I attended the funeral last week, stood at the back of the church, and felt nothing but a profound, inexplicable relief. Is that wrong? Is that a sign of something broken in me? Or is it simply the truth that some things, once set in motion, cannot be stopped, can only be survived? I think about the man who wrote this journal, whose name I never learned, whose fate remains a mystery. I think about the woman with red hair, who she was, what happened to her, why her memory seems to have seeped into the very walls of this house. I think about the thin line between haunting and madness, between seeing ghosts and becoming one. Last night I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the music box playing. I walked to the living room and found it on the mantel where I'd left it. Its lid closed, its mechanism silent. But the melody lingered in my ears, persistent, mocking, a minor key refrain that seemed to say, "You're still here. I'm still here. We're all still here." I haven't told my wife about any of this. She's happier now that the blanket is gone, now that the house has settled into something approaching normalcy. She doesn't need to know that some nights I sit in this study until dawn, reading entries I've memorized, searching for a woman I've never met in the spaces between words. She doesn't need to know that sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see someone else looking back. The house remembers. That's what I've come to believe. It holds on to things, objects, emotions, people, and it doesn't let go. Maybe that's what a haunting really is. Not ghosts, not spirits, but memory given weight. The past refusing to stay buried. I found another entry today, one I somehow missed before. It was tucked between the pages, written on a scrap of paper in handwriting that wasn't the same as the rest. Feminine. Delicate. The ink was faded almost to illegibility, but I could make out the words if I held it to the light. He doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't know I never left. Some houses hold you, some loves won't let go. I read it 3 times before the implication sank in. Then I read it again and again, and somewhere in the house, I couldn't tell where, the music box began to play. My wife called down from the bedroom, asked if everything was all right. I told her yes. I told her I'd be up soon. I told her not to worry. But I'm sitting here now, in the dark, listening to that melody drift through the walls, and I'm wondering, who left that note? When did they leave it? And most importantly, am I the one who's haunted, or am I the one doing the haunting? The music box plays on. The house remembers. And somewhere in the spaces I cannot see, a woman with red hair is watching, waiting, patient as stone. I think she's been waiting for a very long time. I think she'll wait a little longer still. Story 12. Now the rock was heavier than it looked. That was my first thought when her stepdad placed it in my hands. A dense, cold thing about the size of a grapefruit. Its surface carved with the coiling form of a dragon. The scales had been etched with surprising precision, each one catching the dim light of their living room like a tiny black mirror. The creature's eyes were 2 shallow depressions, empty and knowing, and its mouth gaped open in what might have been a roar or a scream. I couldn't tell which. "Found it at an estate sale last month," he said, watching me turn it over in my palms. "Thought you might appreciate it. You're into that fantasy stuff, right?" I nodded, not quite sure what to say. Her stepdad had never given me anything before. In the 8 months I'd been dating his stepdaughter, he'd barely spoken to me beyond the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. Now here he was, pressing this strange artifact into my hands with an eagerness that made something twist in my stomach. "It's really cool," I managed. "Thank you." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. They stayed fixed on the stone, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw relief flicker across his face. Like a man setting down a burden he'd carried too long. I should have left it there. Should have made some excuse, handed it back, walked away. But I didn't. I took it home, set it on my nightstand, and went to sleep thinking nothing of it. That was my first mistake. The dreams started that same night. I don't remember them clearly. No one ever does, not really. But I remember the feeling, a pressure on my chest, like something crouching there in the dark, a sense of being watched by eyes I couldn't see. I woke at 3:47 a.m., gasping, my sheets soaked through with sweat. And for a long moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there staring at the ceiling while my heart tried to claw its way out of my chest. The stone sat on my nightstand, exactly where I'd left it. But in the blue glow of my alarm clock, the dragon's carved eyes seemed deeper somehow, more present. I told myself it was just a nightmare. Told myself I'd eaten too late, stayed up too long scrolling through my phone. Told myself all the reasonable things reasonable people tell themselves when the dark presses too close. But the dreams came back the next night, and the night after that. Within a week, I'd stopped sleeping entirely. Insomnia is a strange thing. It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. First you're just tired, then you're exhausted. Then you're something beyond exhaustion, some hollow-eyed creature wearing your face and stumbling through your life like a ghost haunting its own body. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Shapes that vanished when I turned to look at them. My girlfriend noticed first. She said I looked pale, asked if I was getting sick. I told her I was fine. I told everyone I was fine. The word became a reflex, automatic and meaningless. But I wasn't fine. I was falling apart. The thoughts started around the second week. Not the dreams this time. Something worse. Intrusive whispers that slithered through my mind at the strangest moments. Standing at the top of the stairs, I'd suddenly imagine tumbling down them, bones snapping like dry twigs. Crossing the street, I'd picture myself stepping into traffic, the screech of brakes and the crunch of impact. Holding a kitchen knife, I'd see my own hands turning the blade inward, pressing it against soft flesh. I'd never had thoughts like these before. Never. I was a normal kid from a normal family with a normal life, and suddenly my brain was serving up an endless buffet of ways to end myself. The images were vivid, almost cinematic in their clarity, and they came with a seductive pull that terrified me more than anything else. It would be so easy, something whispered. So quick. So quiet. No one would even notice you were gone. I started avoiding my family, started eating dinner in my room, claiming homework that didn't exist. My mom knocked on my door one evening, her voice soft with concern, asking if everything was okay. I told her I was just stressed about school. She accepted it because she wanted to believe it, and I let her because the truth was too monstrous to speak aloud. How do you tell your mother that something inside you wants to die? The shadow appeared on the 18th day. I was lying in bed, not sleeping. I'd given up on sleep by then, just staring at the ceiling and counting the cracks in the plaster. The house was quiet, that particular brand of silence that only exists in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. My parents were asleep. The world was asleep. Only I remained awake, trapped in this hollow shell of exhaustion and dread. Then I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible, like fabric brushing against fabric, like something moving in the dark. I turned my head toward the doorway, and that's when I saw it. A shape, small, maybe 4 feet tall, hunched in the threshold of my room. It was darker than the darkness around it, a concentrated absence of light that hurt to look at. I couldn't make out features, couldn't see eyes or a face, but I knew that it was watching me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I lay frozen in my bed, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth, while the shadow stood perfectly still in my doorway. Then, with a movement that was somehow both jerky and fluid, it darted to the left and vanished into the hallway. I didn't sleep at all that night. The shadow became a constant presence after that. I'd catch glimpses of it everywhere, ducking around corners, peering through windows, crouching in the spaces where light couldn't reach. always watching, always waiting. I started leaving every light in my room on, even during the day, but it didn't help. The thing seemed to exist in the gaps between illumination, in the blind spots of my vision where certainty gave way to doubt. I tried to tell my girlfriend about it once. We were sitting in her car after school, and she was holding my hand, asking why I'd been so distant lately. I opened my mouth to explain, to tell her about the shadow, the thoughts, the weight of stone that seemed to press heavier on my chest with each passing day. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat like broken glass, and all I could manage was a mumbled apology and a promise to do better. She looked at me with such sadness in her eyes, such helplessness. I wanted to reassure her, to be the person she remembered, but that person felt very far away now.